I raised my hand. Before I could knock, a woman's voice came from inside. Clear, measured. Come in, Mr. Kalen. It took you longer than expected. We were starting to think the old man got to you. I lowered my hand. She knew my name. She knew about the man in the slicker. The room was a jarring contradiction to the rest of the manor. It was small, dusty, but clearly occupied. There was a worn armchair, a portable oil heater, and a small wooden desk. And there was the television, an ancient tube set sitting on a crate. It wasn't playing a show, it was just displaying that hypnotic gray and white static. The yellow light was coming from the low-watt bulb screwed into a hanging cord above the desk. Sitting at the desk was the woman. She was young, mid-30s maybe, dressed simply in a dark sweater and jeans, beautiful in a sharp, fragile way. Her eyes were fixed on the screen, but I knew she was aware of every breath I took. She had a small black book open on the desk, and beside the book, a pistol. Not a decoration. Have a seat, Mr. Kalen, she said, without looking up. She pointed to the armchair. I didn't sit. I walked to the desk, dropped the duffel bag heavily onto the surface, and slid it toward her. The package is secure. The sum is exactly what was specified. My job is done. She glanced down at the bag, then back at the static-filled TV screen. Your job is never done, Thomas. Not out here. She slowly reached out, unzipped the bag, and peeked inside. The rustle of dollar bills. Excellent, she murmured. We keep our promises. She reached beneath the desk and pulled out a briefcase aluminum, scratched but locked. She slid it toward me. Your payment, half now, half upon delivery of the second package. I stared at the briefcase. Second package? The contract was for a single delivery. She finally looked at me. Her eyes were deep set and dark. The contract changes when you follow the lights, Thomas. They told you not to, yet here you are. That shows commitment. I followed the instructions for the drop point, I countered, keeping my voice even. I came to Oakhaven. No, you came to the call, she corrected, a thin smile playing on her lips. Oakhaven is the receiving station, the lights are the beacon, and the payment is the lure. She leaned forward, her voice dropping. The money you just delivered? It's for the power, the maintenance. It pays to keep the system running. What system? I demanded. She looked at the static on the screen, mesmerizing gray snow. The system that keeps the will-o'-the-wisps tethered to this location, she whispered. The system that keeps the rest of the world from noticing the hole in time we've dug here. I looked from her to the static to the yellow light. The old man's words echoed back. The bridge has been down for a long time. I need to know what I'm delivering next, I insisted, my hand instinctively reaching for the briefcase. You're delivering the fuel, she said. The second package is a person, specifically the man who hired you, your client. My blood ran cold. You want me to kidnap my own client? He's not a client. He's a reluctant component, she explained, picking up the small black book on her desk. She flipped it open. The pages were covered in dense, handwritten formulas and diagrams. We were never supposed to pay him. We were only supposed to use him to find someone else, someone who came through the anomaly years ago, someone he was trying to track down. She pointed to a symbol in the book, a circle bisected by a jagged line. This is the luminous anchor, the lights outside. They need to feed. They feed on energy, on static, on displaced souls. She looked straight into my eyes, and her composure finally broke, replaced by a flicker of madness. The girls you saw, Thomas? The ones in the white dresses? They were my sisters. They followed the lights 40 years ago. They are now the conductors, trapped in the static, powering the anomaly. She slammed the book shut. Your client has the genetic signature we need to stabilize the anchor. You bring him back here to this room, and he will be the final ingredient. His energy will free my sisters and allow the anchor to seal this place forever. I backed away, hands up. I'm out. I take my money, and I leave. The deal is void. No, Thomas, she said, her voice now sharp as broken glass. She picked up the pistol and aimed it squarely at my chest. The deal is sealed. You followed the lights. The anchor recognized you. That's why your flashlight failed. That's why the radio spoke. She stood up, tall, menacing. You have been chosen as the next courier of Oakhaven. You bring the final fuel, or you become the next conductor. She pointed the pistol at the door. The man you seek is waiting for you in a cheap motel 20 miles north. You have until dawn. If you fail, the lights will guide you back. And they will not be gentle. I didn't take the briefcase. The money felt tainted, electrified. I turned and ran. I burst out of the house. The sight of my car, parked right where I left it, felt like a miracle. I glanced back at the house. The woman was at the window, not the yellow-lit one, but one on the lower floor. She wasn't aiming the pistol, she was just watching. And then I saw the three lights above the house. They were no longer just blue, green, and purple. They were moving, slowly descending, swirling, their colors blending into a blinding, painful white. I smashed the gear shift into drive and sped away, tearing back up the dirt road. They told me, don't follow the lights. But I did. And now, I was a prisoner to the very thing I was hired to serve. Chapter 3. The Reluctant Component. 20 miles north of Oakhaven, the world came back. GPS signal returned. Phone service returned. The air smelled of diesel and cheap cooking oil. I pulled into the parking lot of the Starlight Inn. It was exactly the kind of place you'd expect a man carrying 10 kilos of cash to hide, faded neon sign, peeling paint, and a scattering of beat-up trucks. I needed to find Robert Vance, the man who hired me, the man who signed the contract, the man who was now the fuel for the Oakhaven anchor. I parked my car, retrieved my now working phone, and found his text message. Room 2, 17. I approached the room. The door was slightly ajar, careless. I drew my own small weapon, a barely legal 9mm I kept for insurance. I pushed the door open with my foot. The room was a mess. Half-eaten food, maps spread across the bed, and a laptop open on the small table. But Robert Vance wasn't there. I scanned the room. No sign of a struggle. No blood. Then I saw the note tacked onto the map. They told me the bridge was down, but I found a new one. I'm going back for her. I leave you the path, Tom. Don't look up. Follow the whispers. Underneath the note, a key. An old-fashioned, heavy iron key, the kind used for a padlock. He went back. The desperate fool. He didn't run. He went back to the source of the anomaly. I looked at the map. It was a topographic survey of the Oakhaven area, dated 1968. A red circle was drawn around the location of the manor, and a dotted line led away from it, snaking through the trees, ending at a small symbol labeled the spire. The spire. Not the anchor. Not the lights. And the dotted line crossed a gap in the road, labeled in faded ink, Oakhaven Bridge. So the old man was lying. Or the bridge had indeed collapsed, and Vance knew of a way across. I put the key in my pocket. I knew I should leave. Drive to the nearest police station. Drive to the nearest airport. Drive until the memory of the woman and the static was just a bad dream. But the fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard anger. I was trapped. If I left, the woman in Oakhaven would hunt me down, or the lights would draw me back. If I went forward, I had a chance to disrupt their plan, to save Vance, and maybe myself. I picked up Vance's laptop. It was open to a file, Oakhaven Thesis, R. Vance. I started reading. Vance was an electromagnetic engineer. His thesis detailed a phenomenon he called temporal static, Vance's thesis. The Oakhaven site is located at a nexus of extreme geomagnetic activity. The unique iron ore deposits act as a funnel. In 1983, a local utility company installed a prototype wireless power transmitter, WPT, tower designed by Dr. Alara Hawthorne, the woman in the room. The WPT's initial high-frequency broadcast created a sustained, localized energy field, the willow, the wisp lights. This field did not transmit power. It created a tear in the localized timeline. The Hawthorne sisters were the first test subjects, trapped as energy conductors within the static field. The luminous anchor, as they call it, must be continually fed to maintain the stability of the tear. When the bridge collapsed, cutting off land access, the Hawthornes developed the courier system to lure people with specific, unique electromagnetic signatures, people who are pre-tuned to the static to become the next conductors, the fuel. I stopped reading. Pre-tuned? I thought of my flashlight failing, the radio whispering. I was pre-tuned. I took the iron key, the map, and my pistol. I was going back to the bridge. Chapter 4. The Spire and the Key. GPS voice. Turn left onto unnamed road, 100 feet. I followed the GPS, turning off the main road and back onto the dirt track. But this time, I didn't drive toward the valley. I drove along the ridge, tracing the path on Vance's map. I finally stopped where the map indicated the Oakhaven Bridge. I walked to the edge of the ravine. I shined my flashlight down. The bridge was gone. Just two concrete pilings standing like broken teeth on either side of a 50-foot drop. The river below was black and fast. I looked around, and then I saw it. Tucked into the bushes was the bridge, or what was left of it. It hadn't collapsed. It had been retracted. A small section of the original steel truss bridge had been pulled back onto the land, bolted to a simple cable and winch system. And bolted to the side of that bridge section was a huge, rusted iron padlock. I pulled out the iron key from Vance's motel room. It fit. I unlocked the padlock. The winch system was old, covered in grease. I pulled the lever. The section of the bridge began to move, sliding across the chasm, connecting the two pilings. When the metal shriek stopped, I had a crossing. A precarious, rusted walkway across the Black River. I didn't hesitate. I was done with running. Halfway across the bridge, I paused. I looked up. The three lights, blue, green, purple, were still hovering over the manor. But now, a fourth light was visible. It was a tiny, faint pinprick of white, far higher than the others. The spire. I crossed the bridge and plunged back into the woods. I followed the dotted line on the map. The atmosphere was different here. No fog, but the air felt charged, like a thunderstorm was constantly brewing. The trees gave way to a small clearing, and in the center stood the spire. It was a nightmare of rural engineering. A 90-foot-tall antenna, rusty and covered in insulator rings, rising from a cinder-block shed. At the top of the spire, the tiny white light glowed. And at the base of the spire, leaning against the shed, was Robert Vance. He was pale, sweating, holding his head. He looked like he'd been dragged backward through a hedge. "Vance!" I hissed. He looked up, terrified. Then relief flooded his face. "Tom, you came back. I knew you would." I rushed to him. "The woman is insane. She wants you for fuel. We need to leave now." Vance shook his head weakly. "No, I can't. I came for her." "Who? The woman with the gun?" "No," he whispered, pointing a shaky finger at the spire. "My wife, Eleanor. She followed the lights 20 years ago. I thought she was dead, but she's not. She's in the static. She's the reason I'm pre-tuned, Tom." He looked at the antenna, his eyes filled with a desperate love. "I'm not the fuel. I'm the key. My presence here will draw her out of the static and into the spire. Then we can shut it down." He grabbed my jacket. "The black book, Tom! Did you see the black book the Hawthorne woman had?" "Yes, formulas and diagrams. It's the instruction manual. The only way to stop the power transfer is to destroy the book. It's the blueprint for the anchor. If she has it, we have to go back to the house." Vance cried out in pain. "She knows I'm here! The spire is reacting to my presence! The anchor is drawing me!" He stumbled, falling to his knees. I looked at Vance, the desperate, broken man. I looked at the spire, the insane piece of technology channeling forgotten horrors, and I knew there was only one path left. "Fine," I said, pulling him up. "You're the key. I'm the courier. We finish the job. We go back and get that goddamn book." Chapter V. The Final Static. We ran across the bridge. With Vance stumbling beside me, it felt like an eternity. We made it back to the house, avoiding the road, moving through the thick undergrowth. When we approached Oakhaven Manor, the three lights were lower now. They pulsed faster. They looked less like lights and more like three enormous, glowing jellyfish. We slipped through the open front door. Vance was whispering, "She's upstairs, in the room with the yellow light. We have to be silent." I led him up the grand staircase. This time, as we climbed, the whispers in the static were clearer, closer. Children's voices. "You followed. Tom. Tommy. So cold." We reached the second-floor landing. The yellow light still shone from the end room. I looked down the hall. I saw her shadow beneath the door, a motionless silhouette. I reached out my hand. "I'll go in first. Create a distraction. You grab the book and run. Lock the anchor down when you get to the spire." Vance nodded, his eyes wide with fear and grim resolve. I kicked the door open. "Hawthorne!" I shouted. The woman was exactly where I left her, at the desk. But she was no longer calm. Her dark eyes were feverish. She was screaming into a small microphone attached to a wire that led to the TV. "Dr. Hawthorne, screaming. The anchor is stabilizing. The key is here. We have the power." I lunged for her, but she was faster. She wheeled around the desk, the pistol leveled at my face. "You brought him," she shrieked, a maniacal grin stretching her face. You chose the light. You chose your destiny, Thomas. We're shutting you down, I yelled. Where is the book? She laughed, a harsh, dry sound. The book? It's here, Tom. But it's not just a book. She opened her coat. Sewn into the lining, against her chest, were pages of the black book, laminated and covered with wires. She was wearing the anchor's manual. I am the blueprint. I am the control. I am Oakhaven. Just then, Vance lunged from the shadows. He wasn't going for the book. He was going for the TV. The moment the TV hit the floor, the static wasn't just noise anymore. It was a tangible force. The yellow light flickered and died. The room was plunged into chaos. The three lights outside began to pulse rapidly through the windows. Hawthorne screamed, dropping the pistol. The wires on her chest began to glow and snap with electricity. The anchor is failing. The conduits are breaking free, she shrieked. Through the window, I saw the impossible. The three will-o'-the-wisp lights, now a blinding, angry white, shot straight up into the sky toward the spire. They weren't tethered anymore. They were free. But as they left, a massive power drain hit the manor. Vance was staring at the pile of shattered TV. A figure was coalescing above it. A woman. Faint, ethereal, but unmistakably a person. Eleanor, Vance choked out, scrambling toward the apparition. She reached out to him. Robert the Spire. Destroy the Spire. The sight of his wife, fading and translucent, gave Vance the last surge of strength he needed. He turned, grabbed a chair leg, and began smashing the wiring on Dr. Hawthorne's chest. As the last piece of the wiring on her coat snapped, Dr. Hawthorne collapsed. The static in the room died instantly. The silence was deafening. The only sound was Vance's ragged breathing and the wind outside. The Spire, I gasped, pulling Vance away from the collapsed Dr. Hawthorne. It's the source. We have to finish it. Chapter 6. The End of the Line. We ran back to the clearing. The spire was now crackling with a terrifying, untethered energy. It was humming not with a drone, but with the sound of pure, raw electricity. And at the base of the spire, three figures were standing. The two little girls in white dresses. And a third, older figure. They were no longer translucent. They were solid. They were free. But they were still terrifying. Their eyes were wide, empty, and fixed on the spire. Vance stopped. My sisters, he whispered, looking at the girls. They're conductors. They can't be free. I didn't care. I pulled my pistol. Vance! The lock! Vance fumbled with the key, his hands shaking. He inserted the iron key into the small cinder block shed at the base of the spire. Inside the shed was a single, humming breaker box, the main power feed for the entire WPT system. Vance rushed in. The three Hawthorne figures did not move. They watched. I heard the sound of a struggle inside the shed. I stood guard, pistol raised, watching the three figures. Go on, I yelled. Do it! The white light at the top of the spire went out. The three Hawthorne figures slumped to the ground. They weren't dead, they were just still. Vance stumbled out of the shed, covered in dust, clutching his chest. It's done, he whispered. The power is out. The temporal static, is gone. I lowered my pistol. The air felt clean, normal, cold. The Oakhaven anomaly was over. Let's go, I said, putting my arm around him. We leave them. We leave everything. We walked toward the woods. As we reached the tree line, I glanced back at the spire. The three figures were gone, and rising slowly over the clearing where the spire had just been was a single, small, faint blue light. I grabbed Vance and pulled him hard. We run! Now! We didn't look back. We ran across the bridge, locked the winch, and drove away from Oakhaven, not slowing down until the sun was a pale smear on the horizon. Epilogue: The Courier's New Life. We reported the house fire at Oakhaven Manor. The police found the skeletal remains of Dr. Hawthorne, who apparently electrocuted herself. No one ever found Robert Vance's briefcase. The money was gone, vanished in the static. Vance and I went our separate ways. He's trying to rebuild his life, searching for a way to communicate with his wife, who he believes is finally at peace. I took a bus west. I got a cheap job. I'm safe. Or so I tell myself. I stopped driving tonight because I saw something in the desert sky. They weren't blue, green, and purple. They were just two. One red, one green. The running lights of a commercial airliner passing far overhead. I sat there, watching them disappear. Normal lights. Safe lights. But then I reached into my pocket and my fingers brushed against the familiar cold metal. The iron key. I never threw it away. And on the dashboard, my phone was flickering. The signal bars were full. But there was a new notification. A text message from an unknown number. I opened it. The text was only 3 words. The bridge awaits. I followed the lights once. They brought me death, static, and ruin. But they also gave me the only freedom I've ever known. They told me, don't follow the lights. But what if they're not warning me anymore? What if they're calling me? The footprints that circled my cabin all night, I'm going to tell you this exactly the way it happened. No embellishments for the sake of a good campfire yarn, because the truth is plenty strange enough. My name's Caleb Ward. Most folks up here in the North Woods of Maine just call me Ward. I'm 52, divorced, 15 years, no kids, and I like it that way. I run a small guiding business out of a hand-built log cabin on the west shore of Moosehead Lake, 27 miles from the nearest plowed road in winter. The cabin sits on a little rise above a cove, ringed by old-growth spruce and fir so thick the sun only hits the roof for about 4 hours a day in November. It's quiet, real quiet. The kind of quiet that makes city people twitchy after the first night. This happened the week before Thanksgiving, 2024. We'd already had 2 hard frosts and a foot of snow that stuck. The lake was starting to skim over at the edges, but the middle was still black water. I'd come in from checking beaver traps around 4 in the afternoon, dusk already bleeding out of the sky. I stoked the wood stove, put a pot of venison stew on, cracked a cold moxie, and sat down with my boots off to listen to the Red Sox postgame on a battery radio that mostly picks up static and French Canadians. That's when I heard it the first time. Not loud, just deliberate. Crunch, pause, crunch, pause, crunch. Slow footsteps in the fresh snow coming from the tree line behind the cabin. I figured it was a bull moose. They get bold this time of year, looking for salt or easy browse. I stepped out onto the porch with the 44 revolver I keep by the door. More for habit than need. Nothing. Tracks led straight out of the woods, circled the cabin once, maybe 10 feet off the logs, and disappeared back into the spruce the same way they came. Big tracks. Bare feet. Human-looking, but way too long and narrow. Toes splayed like they'd never worn a shoe in their life. I laughed at myself. Probably just a prank from one of the local kids who snowmobile up the lake now and then. I shoveled the prints full of snow so I wouldn't have to look at them, went back inside, locked the door, something I rarely do, and ate my stew. At 11:17 p.m., I looked at the clock. It started again. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Same cadence. Same distance from the walls. I sat up in bed with the revolver across my lap and listened as whatever it was walked the exact same circle. Once, twice, 3 times, never faster, never slower, never a voice, never a knock, never the sound of breathing, just that methodical, patient tread. On the 4th lap, it stopped directly under my bedroom window. Dead silence for maybe 2 full minutes, long enough for the sweat to cool on my neck. Then it started again, finished the circle, and walked off into the trees the same way it came. I didn't sleep. At first light, I was outside with coffee going cold in my hand, staring at the trail. 4 perfect laps. The prints never overlapped themselves. Each circuit was placed just inside the previous one, like it was tightening the coil. The stride was over 5 feet between steps, heel barely touching, weight all on the balls of the feet. And cold, Christ, they were cold. The snow inside each print had glazed over with a thin skin of ice, like whatever made them sucked every bit of heat out of the ground. I laid my own boot next to one for comparison. Size 11 Red Wings looked like a child's shoe. I followed the tracks into the woods. 50 yards in, they just stopped. No scuff, no disturbance, no return prints. Gone. Like the earth opened up and swallowed the thing mid-stride. I told myself it was a bear walking upright. Bears do that sometimes. But I've seen bear tracks my whole life, and these weren't bear. I told myself it was a hoax, somebody on snowshoes with fake feet strapped on, but the prints went under low-hanging branches, no adult could stoop beneath without breaking twigs, and nothing was broken. I told myself a lot of things that morning. Night came early. Storm clouds rolling in off the Atlantic, wind moaning in the stovepipe. I brought in enough wood to last 2 days, barred the door with the old crossbeam my grandfather cut in 1938, and loaded both the 44 and the 12 gauge with alternating slugs and double-aught buck. I wasn't proud of it, but I was scared. Real fear. The kind that sits in your gut like frozen lead. 11:07 p.m. It started again. This time, the steps were heavier, like it was pressing down harder, grinding the snow. Same rhythm, same circle. I stood at the window with the shotgun and watched the prints appear one by one in the floodlight I'd wired off the solar batteries. The thing itself stayed just outside the cone of light, a patch of darkness that moved wrong, too fluid, too tall. On the sixth lap, it stopped again under the bedroom window. This time, it stayed. I could feel it, looking at me through the glass. Not see it, just feel it. The temperature in the room dropped so fast, the coffee on the table skimmed over with ice. My breath plumed white. The dog I'd had for 8 years, a big Chesapeake named Boone, crawled under the bed and whimpered like a puppy. Then the voice came. Not through the window, inside my head. Dry, rasping, like wind over dead leaves. You left the circle open, Caleb. I damn near pulled the trigger through the glass. Instead, I backed up until my shoulders hit the log wall and I started praying out loud. The Lord's Prayer, the 23rd Psalm, anything I could remember from childhood. The presence withdrew. The footsteps started again, finished 2 more slow laps, and walked off into the trees. Same thing the next night. And the next. Each night, the circle got smaller. Each night, the voice added another sentence. Second night. You left the circle open, Caleb. It has to close. Third night. You left the circle open, Caleb. It has to close. I'm so tired of walking. By the fourth night, the prints were less than 5 feet from the walls. The thing would stop under the window and stand there for 10-15 minutes at a time. I hadn't slept in 3 days. My eyes looked like burned holes in a blanket. Boone wouldn't come out from under the bed even to eat. That fourth night, the wind was howling 40 knots, snow hissing against the logs like sand. I sat in the rocker with the shotgun across my knees and waited. 11:11 p.m. The steps began. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Tighter now. So close, I could hear the individual ice crystals breaking under its weight. It circled 8 times, each circuit shaving another 6 inches off the radius. On the 8th lap, it didn't walk away. It stopped at the front door and waited. Silence, except for the storm. Then the doorknob rattled slow. Deliberate testing. Once, twice. The crossbeam held. I raised the shotgun. The voice again, soft as a lover. Let me in, Caleb. I'm almost home. I don't know what possessed me. Maybe exhaustion, maybe something older, but I asked it. What circle? My voice cracked like a 12-year-old's. What damn circle did I leave open? For a long time, nothing. Then the answer came, not in words, but as memory. My memory shoved into my head like a splinter under a fingernail. 34 years ago, I was 18, drunk on peach schnapps, camping with my cousin Darren on this same piece of land before the cabin was even a dream. We found an old foundation in the woods, just some moss-covered fieldstones in a perfect circle about 20 feet across. Inside were strange carvings on a flat rock, spirals and eyes, and things that hurt to look at directly. Darren, always the show-off, pissed on the center stone and dared whatever Indian ghosts were listening to do something about it. I laughed and threw an empty bottle that shattered on the rock. We never spoke of it again. 2 weeks later, Darren wrapped his Trans Am around a telephone pole outside Bangor. Dead on impact. I joined the army the next month and tried to outrun the memory for 15 years. The thing outside knew. I broke then. I sobbed like a baby with the shotgun shaking in my hands. I'm sorry, I whispered to the door. I didn't know. I was just a dumb kid. The footsteps started again. Slow, almost gentle. It walked one final circle. So close, the floodlight caught the edge of a heel. Gray skin, black veins, toes too long, split and bleeding frost. Then it stopped at the threshold and waited. I knew what I had to do. I laid the shotgun down, unbarred the door, and opened it wide. The storm rushed in, snow devils spinning across the floorboards. The thing stood just outside the light, taller than the doorframe, thin as fence wire, head tilted like it was listening to something far away. I stepped over the threshold into the blowing snow and closed the door behind me. Boone howled once from under the bed, a sound I'll take to my grave. I walked to the old foundation. Somehow I knew exactly where it was, even under 3 feet of fresh snow. The thing walked behind me, never touching, never hurrying. When I reached the circle of stones, I knelt and brushed the snow away with my bare hands until my fingers bled. The center rock was still there, carvings glowing faintly blue under the frost. I placed both palms flat on it and spoke the only apology I had left. "I'm sorry." Close the circle. The glow flared, cold fire running up my arms. Something ancient and exhausted sighed through the trees. The tall shadow behind me folded in on itself like burning paper. The wind died between one heartbeat and the next. When I came back to the cabin an hour later, my beard was white with rime and my hands were black with frostbite, but the footprints were gone. Not melted, gone. The snow around the cabin was smooth and trackless, as if no one had walked there in 100 years. I lost 3 fingers that winter. Doctors called it extreme frostbite. I let them think what they wanted. Every November since, when the lake starts to skim and the spruce creak in the wind, I leave a bottle of peach schnapps and a small circle of salt on that center stone. I've never seen the footprints again. But sometimes, just before dawn, I wake up knowing something tall and tired is standing outside the bedroom window, listening to make sure the circle stays closed. And I sleep better for it. I answered the door, but no one lives within 20 miles. My name is Elias Vance, and I run from silence. Not the quiet of a library or the hush of a winter morning, but the deep, echoing silence of the high lonesome. A silence that doesn't just mean a lack of noise, it means a lack of life. And I know that silence better than any man alive, because I chose it. 3 years ago, I bought what locals in the nearest town, a speck of dust called Oakhaven, called the Acker Folly. It was a cabin, really, a rough-hewn cedar box built into the spine of the Bitterroot Mountains, tucked so far into a federal land carve-out that the closest paved road was a 2-hour drive down a kidney-rattling gravel track. I was a man looking to disappear, not from the law, but from the relentless, maddening static of the world. My nearest neighbor, as the crow flies, was 23 miles away. As the truck drives, it was closer to 35. Cell service was non-existent. Landline? The pole stopped 10 miles back. I had satellite internet and a wood stove. That was my world. It was glorious. For 2 years, it was exactly what I needed. Just me, the howl of the wind and the ponderosas, and the occasional deer pausing at my creek. The silence was a blanket. Then came the night the silence broke. Not with a roar, but with a sound so profoundly, impossibly wrong, it felt like a hole punched through the fabric of reality itself. I remember the date because it was election night, and I was tracking the results on my laptop, the screen a sickly blue glow in the darkness of the cabin. The temperature had plummeted, and the air smelled of wood smoke and coming snow. It was maybe 11:30 p.m. I was pouring myself a final cup of instant coffee, watching the electoral map turn red and blue, when I heard it. It wasn't a thump or a knock caused by the wind catching a loose shutter. It was a clear, concise, and utterly deliberate rapping. Tock, tock, tock. It came from the main door, the heavy, bolted cedar plank that separated my refuge from the high country night. I froze. The cup stopped halfway to the counter. Every nerve ending in my body, dulled by 2 years of solitude, suddenly sparked with raw, high-voltage terror. This wasn't a bear. Bears scrape and scratch. This wasn't a tree limb. Those are random, chaotic. This was a pattern, a human pattern. Talk, talk, talk. A pause. Talk, talk, talk. My mind, trained in logic and skepticism from my previous life, immediately started running through the probabilities. 0. The probability was 0. No one, absolutely no one, ever came here. Delivery drivers stopped at the turnoff with a note explaining the isolation. Hikers didn't stray this far off the marked trails, especially not at midnight in near-freezing temperatures. The locals wouldn't. They respected the unspoken rule of live and let live that governed these mountains, and they certainly wouldn't be polite enough to knock 3 times. I set the coffee down with agonizing slowness. I reached for the rifle I kept racked above the fireplace, a lever-action Winchester, a purely defensive measure. The metal was icy cold beneath my fingers. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice rough and too loud in the sudden, complete silence that followed the last rap. I aimed my voice to project authority, but it came out sounding brittle, like thin ice. No answer. Only the sound of the pressure lamp hissing gently on the small dining table. Outside, the night was a void of absolute crushing blackness. I moved to the door, my heart doing a frantic, uneven rhythm against my ribs. The door has a single, small peephole, a fisheye lens that looks out onto the porch. I kept the rifle low, pointed at the floor, and leaned my eye to the glass. The porch light was off. It was battery-powered, and I rarely used it. All I could see through the lens was the deep, velvety black of the night, cut by the faint, diffused light from my own windows reflecting back a few feet away. Then, a shape. It wasn't centered in the lens, but off to the right, a form silhouetted against the dark. It was tall, taller than me, and I'm 6'2". It wasn't moving. It was just standing there. I couldn't make out any features, not even a glint of an eye or a reflection off a coat. It was pure shadow, a columnar shape that absorbed the little bit of light escaping the cabin. It was wearing something that suggested a human frame, but it was too smooth, too still. I stayed absolutely motionless, holding my breath, my eye glued to the peephole. I waited for it to breathe, to shift its weight, to do anything that betrayed it as a living person. It didn't. And then the knocking started again. But this time, it was different. It wasn't a rap on the wood. It was a scritch, a light, repetitive scratching, like a fingernail dragging slowly down the cedar grain. It was coming from the very bottom of the door. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It had crouched down. Whatever it was, it had moved from the standing position I saw in the peephole down to the base of the door, and was now making this unnerving, insect-like sound. I backed away instantly, raising the rifle. My mouth was dry. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a confused hunter. This was wrong. Fundamentally, sickeningly wrong. I glanced around the cabin. My cabin was a fortress of wood and glass, but in that moment, it felt like a thin paper lantern. I had to know what was out there. If it was hostile, I had the advantage of the steel door and the rifle. If it was injured, a very, very remote chance I couldn't just leave it. I took a deep, steadying breath, aimed the rifle at the center of the door, and slowly, deliberately reached for the deadbolt. "I'm armed," I announced, my voice, a command this time. "Step back from the door. Now." The scratching stopped immediately. Silence descended once more, heavy and thick like wet soil. I waited 5, then 10 seconds. No sound. I slowly pulled the heavy bolt free, then twisted the latch. The lock released with a loud thunk. The only thing holding the door closed now was the jamb itself. I paused, leaning my shoulder against the wall, rifle ready. I waited for any sound of movement, of footsteps retreating. Nothing. Finally, with a burst of adrenaline-fueled recklessness, I used my free hand to yank the door open. I threw it wide, revealing the entire porch and the surrounding moonless night. I had the rifle sighted on where the dark shape had been, on the doormat, on the edge of the porch railing, but there was nothing. The porch was empty. No figure. No sound. No tracks in the patchy dirt surrounding the porch. The only thing I could smell was the sharp, clean scent of the pine forest and the cold air. I held the rifle up, scanning the line of trees about 20 yards out, where the shadows started to get too thick for the light of my windows to penetrate. I stood there for a full minute, stock still, listening to the wild, desperate pounding of my own heart. Nothing. I slowly lowered the rifle, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the heavy weapon. My breath was clouding the cold air. I walked out onto the porch, holding the rifle at the ready. I searched the ground, expecting a muddy boot print, a dropped cigarette, maybe a glove. Nothing. The ground was untouched, save for my own footprints from earlier that day. I locked the door again, sinking the heavy bolt home with a sound of finality that did little to calm me. I set the rifle back in its rack and stared at the empty door. Who was it? How did they get here? More importantly, how did they leave without making a sound or leaving a trace? My initial terror was starting to curdle into a cold, hard knot of disbelief. I went to the computer and pulled up a map of my location, confirming what I already knew. The closest established human habitation was the dilapidated ranch house of Old Man Peterson, a good 23 miles of unmaintained road away. I couldn't sleep. The silence had returned, but it was ruined now. It wasn't a blanket anymore. It was a vacuum, and I felt like I was floating, utterly alone and exposed inside it. I spent the next 2 days obsessively checking the perimeter of my cabin, scanning the woods with binoculars, and feeling a rising tide of paranoia. I even went to Oakhaven for supplies, partly for food, but mostly for the momentary, desperate comfort of being around other people. I told myself it was just a hunter, confused, maybe drunk, who had stumbled onto my private lane, realized his mistake, and slipped away like a deer. The explanation felt weak and pathetic. Hunters don't knock, they call out. I returned to the cabin, feeling marginally better. I told myself the isolation was playing tricks on me. That's what happens when you spend too long without human contact. Your mind begins to manufacture company. That fragile peace lasted exactly 3 hours. I was cleaning my kitchen counter, the mundane task, a desperate attempt to anchor myself in reality when the power went out. The satellite modem, the laptop, the refrigerator all went dead with a soft click. My cabin is wired to a large, expensive diesel generator, maintained religiously. It shouldn't go out. It certainly shouldn't go out without the sound of the engine sputtering first. I grabbed my flashlight and headed down to the basement, where the generator was housed in a reinforced shed outside. The basement door was a heavy slab of particle board. I pulled it open and shined the beam down the wooden steps. The beam landed on the generator's main breaker box, which was mounted on the shed wall. The panel was open, and someone had systematically, surgically cut every single wire inside the box, not with a hasty chop, but with precise, clean snips, leaving uniform inches of insulation on the severed wires. It looked like a surgeon had gone in and deliberately excised every major artery. A cold, sick certainty gripped me. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a faulty piece of equipment. Someone had been here while I was in Oakhaven, or worse, while I was asleep. And they had sabotaged my connection to the world. They hadn't stolen anything. They hadn't touched the diesel tank or the tools. They had only killed the power. I stepped out of the basement, holding the flashlight high, casting a jittering beam across the darkened living room. The air was thick with a new metallic smell, the smell of ozone and freshly cut copper. The fear I felt that night of the knock was nothing compared to this. The knock was a mystery. This was a statement. A violation. I am here, and you are alone. I moved like a phantom through my own home, locking every window latch, chambering around in the Winchester, and trying to decide my next move. Without power, my satellite connection was dead. My only vehicle was my old F-250 pickup. I could leave. I could drive away. Right now. And not look back. But the moment I touched the keys, a new thought, colder than the mountain air, stopped me. If they cut the power, what did they do to my truck? I shined the flashlight through the mudroom window onto the truck parked 50 feet away. It looked fine, intact. I crept out the back door, rifle ready, and approached the vehicle. I didn't open the door. I walked straight to the engine bay. I unlocked the hood, and with a terrible scraping sound, I lifted it up. The flashlight beam danced over the engine block. The air filter was intact. The battery looked fine. But when I shined the light on the main wire harness, the thick cluster of cables that runs from the battery to the ignition, I saw it. It wasn't cut. It wasn't severed. It was neatly, methodically, and surgically removed. The entire harness, from its junction points on the firewall to its contacts on the starter, was gone. It had been taken with a level of mechanical precision that suggested not vandalism, but professional deconstruction. It would take a mechanic hours to replace. I sank back against the fender, the cold metal shocking me through my shirt. They didn't want me to talk to anyone. They didn't want me to see anything. And now, they didn't want me to leave. I was trapped, 23 miles from help. No power, no phone, no transportation. I had never felt fear that heavy, that physically oppressive. It was like wearing a lead suit. I slammed the hood down, the sound echoing in the deserted wilderness. I ran back inside, slamming and bolting the back door. I piled up furniture in front of both doors, a pointless gesture, but one that brought a small animalistic comfort. I sat in the dark living room, the rifle across my lap, the beam of my flashlight directed at the ceiling, trying to conserve the batteries. Hours bled by. The silence was back, but it was worse than ever. It was a listening silence. Around 4 a.m., the first snowfall started. Not a flurry, but a silent, heavy shower of huge, pristine flakes. It was a beautiful sight, except for what it meant. Any chance of tracks, any fleeting evidence of my intruder would soon be erased, buried under a pristine white blanket. And then, just as a faint, sickly gray light was beginning to touch the highest peaks outside my window, it happened again. Talk, talk, talk. Clear, concise, deliberate, on the front door. I nearly jumped out of my skin. My heart hammered against my ribs, a deafening drumbeat in the stillness. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I simply raised the rifle and stared at the dark, bolted door. Talk, talk, talk. I looked through the peephole. The porch light was still dead, but the pre-dawn gloom was just enough to give some shape to the surroundings. And there it was, not the tall shadow this time. Something small, something low to the ground. Huddled against the door, almost below the peephole's lowest angle, was a figure. It was bent, its head bowed, and it seemed to be wearing a child's tattered raincoat. But its posture was what sent the true jolt of ice through my veins. It was the posture of absolute, crushing defeat. It looked like a child, exhausted and weeping, huddled out of the wind. I was horrified. A lost kid? Out here? It was unthinkable. "Hey!" I whispered harshly, pressing my face close to the door. "Who is it? Are you hurt?" The figure didn't move. I waited. The snow was falling faster now, accumulating quickly on its shoulders. "Listen to me," I said, my voice softer, less panicked. "I can help you. I can get you inside. But you have to tell me your name." The figure slowly raised its head. It was still in shadow, but I could make out the general shape of its face through the fisheye lens. It was too pale, terribly, sickeningly white. And then I heard the sound it made. Not a voice, not a word. It was a soft, wet sniff, and then it reached a hand up, a small, pale hand with long, slender fingers, and tapped lightly, politely on the peephole itself. Tap, tap. I jerked back violently, stumbling over the chair I had used to barricade the door. I scrambled to catch my balance, my heart in my throat. I realized, with a crushing, sickening certainty, that it hadn't raised its hand to knock. It had raised its hand to look back at me. It was too close. The shape of its face was fundamentally wrong. The eyes were too large, black, and reflecting the light of my dying flashlight like twin pools of oil. The tap on the glass wasn't a request for entry. It was an acknowledgement. "I know you're watching." I retreated to the kitchen, clutching the rifle. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that this wasn't a lost child, or a confused hunter, or an elaborate prank. I didn't know what it was, but it wasn't human. Not anymore. And it was out there, in the deepening snow, knowing I was trapped, knowing I was alone, and knowing I was watching. The knocking began again, but not on the door. This time it was on the walls, everywhere. Thump, thump, thump from the north wall. Then immediately, thump, thump, thump from the east. Thump, thump, thump from the roof. They were surrounding me. They were many, and I answered the door. But no one lives within 20 miles. Something was breathing under the snow. The sound was maddening. It wasn't the uniform, polite, triple rap of the first encounter. This was an uneven, chaotic, yet systematic drumming. Thump, thump, thump on the kitchen wall, followed by a lighter tap-tap on the high attic window. Then a heavy crack that sounded suspiciously close to the back porch. They weren't trying to break in, not yet. They were encircling me. They were playing. I retreated from the kitchen to the center of the living room, standing on the braided rug, away from the windows that now felt like gaping, vulnerable holes. The meager gray light of dawn was filtering through the snow-laden air, turning the inside of the cabin into a murky, suffocating twilight. The thumping stopped, as abruptly as it began. Silence, the ultimate weapon of the mountains. I listened with agonizing focus. I listened for the snap of a twig, the soft shush of snowshoes, the scrape of fabric against the cedar siding. I heard nothing but the roaring drum in my own chest and the gentle hiss of the snow accumulating outside. Then I noticed it. A shadow moved across the window. Too slow for a man walking, too high for a deer. It was a shifting, dark mass passing just beyond the window frame, blocking the faint light, then moving on. I didn't dare move to look. I held my breath, pointing the Winchester at the wall where the shadow had passed, waiting for the breach. But the shadow didn't come back. My focus turned from the walls to the floor. The cabin had a dirt floor crawl space, and the floorboards were old cedar planks, prone to creaking. I had always been able to feel the slightest shift in the foundation. Now I felt a vibration, a low, persistent thrumming, more felt than heard. It was coming up from the darkness beneath my feet, like a heart beating slowly, ponderously, deep in the earth. I knelt, pressing my ear to the cold wood. The air in the cabin was getting colder, the heat from the dead stove bleeding away. The thrumming intensified. It was deep, massive. And then I heard the whisper. It wasn't right next to my ear. It was distant, distorted, as if someone was speaking into a wet clay pipe 50 feet away. It seemed to come from directly beneath the floorboards, filtered up through the dirt and wood. It was indistinct, just a garbled murmur, a sound of wet lips forming broken, meaningless consonants. But one syllable, one single word, came through clearly, chilling me to the marrow. Elias. My name, spoken in that hollow, underground echo. It was impossible. How could they know my name? I had changed it legally 5 years ago. No one in Oakhaven knew my past. I hadn't told a soul. I had erased myself, but the whisper knew me. The thing under the house knew me. I scrambled back, knocking over a chair. This was no longer just about survival. This was about a profound personal violation. This was a mystery that clawed into the darkest parts of my solitude. I backed toward the fireplace, kneading the solid wall behind me, my eyes darting frantically around the room. I had to get out. I had to face the storm, face the unknown things waiting outside, because the cabin, my sanctuary, had become the cage. I thought of the truck. Useless. I thought of the 23 miles to Peterson's ranch, a death march in the snow. My gaze fell on the axe I kept in a bucket by the stove. It was a heavy, splitting maul, good for splitting pine rounds. Better than nothing. I grabbed the maul and the rifle. I couldn't run, but I could hide or I could fight. My only chance was to check the generator shed again. If I could get the engine running, even without the harness, I could get light, and the loud, blessed noise of the diesel engine might be enough to drive the things away. Noise was life. I moved to the back door, the rear of the house. I pressed my eye to the back window. The snow was falling in dense sheets now, a white curtain. I could barely see the corner of the generator shed 30 feet away. But as I peered out, I noticed something strange about the snow on the ground near the shed. The white blanket was pristine, except for a large, uneven section near the shed's foundation. It wasn't just melted, it was disturbed. It looked like something had been burrowing or stirring just beneath the surface. And then I saw the puffs. Coming up from the snow, in the exact spot of the disturbance, were tiny, irregular puffs of steam. They were faint, dissipating almost instantly in the cold air, but they were definitely there. Something was breathing under the snow. It was large enough to generate body heat that was melting the surrounding snow, and it was alive enough to be exhaling warm, wet vapor into the freezing air. It was positioned perfectly between me and the generator shed. The thrumming beneath the cabin floor stopped. All sound ceased again, except for the hypnotic shush of the falling snow. The silence now felt like the held breath of a predator. I decided to use the only tool I had left: distraction. I had a cache of road flares I used for emergencies. They were bright, loud, and burned for 15 minutes. I crept to the mudroom and pulled out the metal box. I took 2 flares and moved back to the living room window, the window where the tall shadow had passed earlier. I unlatched the heavy wooden lock slowly, agonizingly, trying not to make a sound. The lock clicked softly. I carefully eased the window open just enough to slide the flare through, aiming it for the patch of disturbed snow near the shed. I twisted the cap and pulled the trigger. With a loud hiss and a blinding flash of incandescent red, the flare ignited. I shoved it out the window and let it drop into the snow. The sudden, violent light cut through the gloom like a knife. The entire backyard, moments before a canvas of menacing shadow, was drenched in a stark, bloody red. The blast of light and noise revealed the ground near the generator shed. There was a depression in the snow, a disturbed, muddy-looking patch, and in the center of that patch, the snow had been thrown aside to reveal the black earth beneath. But it wasn't earth. The red light illuminated a surface that was dark, slick, and slightly segmented, like the carapace of a massive subterranean insect. It was low, maybe 3 feet long, and utterly motionless. The puffing steam I had seen must have been coming from the gaps between the segments. And then, as I stared, paralyzed by the sheer unbelievable sight, the surface began to split. The 2 main segments of the thing opened slowly, like heavy, wet curtains, revealing what was inside: a hollow, gaping space. And inside that space, glowing faintly in the red light of the flare, was a perfectly arranged, gleaming white collection of human teeth. Not sharp, predatory teeth, but flat, blunt human molars arranged in 3 concentric circles, like a deep-sea feeding mechanism. The thing was a mouth, a massive, subterranean mouth waiting. And then a sound came from that hole. Not the wet sniff of the child, not the echo of my name, but a clear, loud giggle. A child's giggle. Sweet, innocent, and pure. My control snapped. I raised the Winchester and emptied the 5-round magazine into the red-lit horror. Blam, blam, blam. The noise was deafening inside the cabin, the smell of gunpowder instantly acrid. The bullets slammed into the thing's exposed interior with a sickening wet thwack. The red light from the flare flickered on the wet segments. The giggling stopped. The mouth closed slowly, silently, drawing the segments together. The whole thing settled back into the disturbed earth, and then, slowly, a blanket of fresh snow began to slide down over the hole, covering the segments once more. The flare sputtered, casting shadows that danced wildly. The thing didn't retreat. It didn't scream. It just waited. I fumbled for more ammunition, my hands trembling violently, but there was no time. From the front of the cabin, through the front door, I heard a new sound, the sound of wet wood tearing. They weren't just knocking anymore. They were coming in. I ran to the front door, pulling the maul off the floor. I shone my failing flashlight on the barricade. The heavy cedar planks were splintering around the main deadbolt. Whatever was on the other side was exerting a steady, massive pressure. And then the heavy cedar planking around the peephole gave way with a loud pop of severed wood fiber. A black, slender finger, dripping with melting snow and sap, poked through the small hole where the peephole lens used to be. The finger flexed, feeling around, slowly sweeping left and right. I raised the maul, my breath coming in, painful, shallow gasps. I was going to lose this fight. I was 35 miles from any help, armed with a rifle and an axe, fighting things that came through the snow and knew my name. Just as the finger started to trace the lock mechanism, I heard a distant, blessed sound. The dull, persistent drone of an engine. It was faint, barely audible over my frantic breathing, but it was there. A vehicle, approaching from the direction of the gravel road. The finger froze in the lock mechanism. The pressure on the door instantly vanished. The heavy silence returned, now layered with the approaching drone. The approaching noise was too much for them. The sound of human civilization, of a machine with the power to leave, was their repellent. I held my position, rifle up, watching the splintered hole. The finger retracted, slowly, leaving a dark streak of mud and water on the white wood. The drone of the engine grew louder, closer. It sounded like an ATV or a light truck struggling up the grade. I waited until I heard the engine stop right outside my perimeter. I walked to the window and cautiously peered out through the snow. Sitting in the patchy clearing, 20 yards from my porch, was an old, beaten-up Forest Service truck, snow-laden and idling noisily. A man was getting out of the driver's side. He was huge, bundled in a thick parka and wearing a wide-brimmed felt hat. He was looking up at my cabin, which was dark, silent, and littered with barricades. He turned toward the porch, and that's when I saw his face. It was the sheriff, a big man named Dale, who had been amiable but distant during my rare visits to Oakhaven. He slowly walked toward the porch, the snow crunching loudly under his heavy boots. "Elias!" His voice boomed, cutting cleanly through the silence. "You all right in there? I saw your smoke stop 2 days ago. Thought I'd check up on a neighbor." He called me a neighbor, a word I hadn't heard in years. I rushed to the door, tearing away the chair, throwing the bolt. I opened the door, maul still in my hand. Dale took one look at my wild eyes, the rifle, the splinters, and the maul, and his expression changed from concern to professional alarm. "What in the hell happened, Vance?" he asked, his hand drifting to the sidearm on his hip. "They cut my power, Dale," I gasped, the words tumbling out. "They took my truck's harness, and they were here. Right now. They were knocking." Dale scanned the empty porch, then the untouched snow around the perimeter. He looked back at the deep, dense forest. The snow was falling heavily, already burying the slightest trace. "I don't see anything, Elias. Just you, looking like you've seen the devil. They were here, under the house, in the snow, on the door. I shot one of them. It looked like a mouth." He took a slow step back. His eyes narrowed. "Look, Elias, you need to come with me. Get your gear. We're going down to Oakhaven." But as he said the word Oakhaven, his eyes drifted past me toward the interior of my dark, wrecked cabin. They fixed on the splintered wood where the peephole used to be. He slowly approached the door. I could see his breath clouding in the cold air. "Did they get inside, Elias?" he asked, his voice low and serious. "No," I insisted, shaking my head violently. "They just poked a finger through." I opened the door before they could break in. Dale reached out a massive, gloved hand and gently touched the splintered hole. He pulled the glove back slowly. There, on the edge of the splintered wood, where the finger had retracted, was a faint, wet streak. Dale looked at the streak, then back at me. His eyes were cold and heavy. "Elias," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. That finger was poking through from inside the cabin. I didn't understand. I had opened the door. I had been standing here. He pointed to the splintered wood, then to the lock. "The splinters, Elias. They're pushed outward. Whatever did this was trying to get out." A cold sweat broke across my back. The thrumming from the floor, the whisper of my name, the figure I saw at the peephole. It wasn't trying to come in. It was already inside. The sheer, dizzying terror of the realization hit me like a physical blow. The figure at the door, the whispering, the scratching. It was an elaborate piece of theater to get me to focus on the outside, to draw my eyes away from the interior of my own home. My eyes swept across my cabin, the dark corners, the shadows cast by the dying flashlight. I looked at Dale, his face a mask of concern and deep worry. I knew he was seeing a man breaking down, not a man fighting an impossible war. "You need to leave, Elias," Dale said, stepping back towards the safety of his running truck. "I'm calling the state, boys. You're not safe here. Come on." I looked at the sheriff, then at the Forest Service truck, my only way out. I was trembling too hard to speak. I was 2 steps from leaving, 2 steps from safety. But then I saw a tiny detail on the sheriff's parka, something I hadn't noticed in the dim light. On the shoulder, stuck to the rough fabric, was a small, pale flake of wood. It was cedar. The same clean, pale wood that made up my floorboards. It was the exact color of the splinters around my door. And it was covered in the same slick black mud and water that had been on the retreating finger. I looked at Dale's hands. They were covered in thick, dark leather gloves. He hadn't touched the splintered wood. He had kept his hands at his side. But when he pointed to the peephole, he had pulled back his gloved hand. And yet, the flake of wet cedar was on his shoulder. He hadn't been standing outside my cabin for long. He couldn't have picked that up from the snowy ground. It must have come from a struggle, from a close physical contact with the damaged wood. And then I remembered the whisper. "Elias," the whisper that came from deep beneath the floor, from the crawl space. Dale wasn't standing on the porch when he checked up on a neighbor. He hadn't been standing in the snow, waiting. He had been beneath the house, doing the whispering, doing the thrumming, and leaving those faint, wet puffs of breath in the snow. He had simply waited for me to open the door. I backed away slowly, raising the rifle a final time. Not at the chest, but at the face. "Don't come any closer, Dale," I whispered. He stopped, his eyes wide and innocent. "Elias, what are you doing? It's just me." "The splinters," I said, my voice shaking with cold fury. "They're pushed outward, and you have cedar on your shoulder." The smile that spread across the sheriff's face was not Dale's smile. It was too wide, too slow, and it exposed too many teeth, clean, white, blunt molars, just like the ones I saw in the dark mouth under the snow. He didn't move his hands. He just stood there, the snow falling softly around his hat. "I just wanted to see if you would answer," the thing wearing Dale's face said, its voice still a perfect, warm imitation of the sheriff. "The rules are very specific. Once you acknowledge us, we can come in." It took a slow, deliberate step toward me, and I pulled the trigger. The shot was deafening. The figure crumpled instantly, hitting the porch with a sound of heavy, waterlogged fabric. The hat rolled away into the snow. The body was huge, still wearing the parka, but already starting to deflate, to sink into the deep pile of the coat like a discarded puppet. I stood there, gasping, staring at the empty, melting shape. I had killed Dale. Or whatever was wearing him. I looked at the Forest Service truck, still idling, still my only hope. I looked at the dark forest, waiting for the silence to break. I took one last look at my ravaged home, the floorboards now throbbing, with a low, deep thrum again, and I made a choice. I ran. Not back inside, but past the figure on the porch, toward the running engine. I didn't look back at the dark mouth waiting by the generator shed, or at the figure in the snow that I had shot. I got into the truck, threw it into reverse, and smashed the accelerator. The tires spun on the snow and mud, then caught. I drove backward, careening blindly down the long, treacherous track, the rifle bouncing on the passenger seat. I drove for 2 hours, until the gravel turned to pavement and the snow turned to rain. and the first scattered lights of a small town appeared on the horizon. I didn't stop until I saw the fluorescent glow of a gas station sign. I never went back. I abandoned the cabin, the folly, the silence. I am writing this now from a noisy, cramped apartment in a city where the nearest neighbor is 6 feet away, and the incessant sound of traffic is my blanket. I keep telling myself it was a shared delusion, a reaction to the isolation, an episode of madness brought on by mountain life. But sometimes, late at night, when the city noise dies down to a hush, I feel the thrumming in the floor, and I hear the whisper. And I know that isolation didn't play tricks on me. Isolation was the bait. I answered the door, and in the deep, unexplained wilderness of the high country, the rules changed. The thing that came in through the cracks, the thing that knew my name, is still looking for the man who answered. And every time I hear a knock on my apartment door, even in the middle of a crowded building, I freeze. Because I know that no matter where I am, and no matter how many people live around me, someone is always watching the door. The Frozen Man Who Knocked Twice. This story comes from a guy I'll call Ryan. 29 years old, works remote as a cybersecurity analyst, lives alone, and up until December of 2023, he would have told you he didn't believe in anything he couldn't ping with a packet sniffer. Ryan's the kind of dude who keeps his thermostat at exactly 67 degrees year-round, owns 3 different smart doorbells, and has a Ring, a Nest, and a Wise, all pointed at his front porch, because redundancy is peace of mind. He lives in a split-level house on a cul-de-sac in Londonderry, New Hampshire. Quiet town, mostly families and retirees. His backyard drops off into about 40 acres of state forest that nobody really hikes once the snow gets deep. December 17th, 2023, they got slammed with the first real nor'easter of the season. 22 inches in 18 hours, wind gusting to 50, power lines snapping like guitar strings all over southern New Hampshire. Ryan's house stayed warm because he's got a whole house generator that kicks in within 8 seconds of an outage. Dude's prepared. Around 11:45 p.m., he's sitting on the couch in sweatpants and a hoodie, eating cold lo mein straight from the carton, scrolling Reddit's no sleep because he's bored and the internet is one of the few things still working. Power outside is long gone. The only light is from his TV and the blue glow of the Christmas tree he only put up because his mom guilt-tripped him on FaceTime. That's when he hears the first knock. Knock, knock. 2 slow, deliberate knocks on the front door. Not the doorbell, the actual wood of the door. Hard enough that the wreath jumps on its little nail. Ryan freezes. Fork halfway to his mouth. He's not expecting anyone. Delivery drivers don't come in a blizzard. His friends are all smart enough to stay home. He mutes the TV, waits 10 seconds, nothing. He figures it's ice falling off the gutter or a branch hitting the siding. Happens. He unmutes, takes another bite. Knock. Knock. Same rhythm. Same spot. Louder this time. The wreath actually falls off and hits the floor mat inside. At this point, Ryan's heart is doing that thing where it feels like it's trying to punch its way out of his ribcage. He pulls up the camera, feeds on his phone. All 3 cameras are night vision green. Porch is empty. Snow blowing sideways so hard it looks like TV static. No footprints on the steps. No car in the driveway except his own, already buried under 1.5 feet of fresh powder. He does what any rational millennial does. He texts the group chat. Ryan, yo, someone just knocked. Like, hard. Y'all messing with me? Crickets. Everyone's either asleep or their towers are down from the storm. He grabs the aluminum baseball bat he keeps in the umbrella stand, more for peace of mind than actual self-defense, and walks to the door. Looks through the peephole, nothing but swirling snow. He's about to turn away when the knocks come a 3rd time. Knock? Knock? These ones are different. Slower. Wetter. Like the fist making them is soaked. Ryan yanks the door open, ready to swing. Empty porch. Snow piling so fast you can almost watch it grow. The motion light didn't even trigger. No prints on the welcome mat, no prints leading up the steps, nothing. He's standing there in his socks getting blasted by Arctic wind when he notices the door itself. 2 perfect handprints, right at adult shoulder height, pressed into the frost on the outside of the storm door. The kind of prints you only get when skin is warm and wet and touches something cold. Except the handprints are huge. Fingers way too long, palm almost the size of a dinner plate, and they're already starting to ice over. Ryan slams the door, triple checks every lock, and drags the couch in front of it like that's gonna help. He spends the next 2 hours watching the cameras on his phone, jumping at every shadow the wind makes. Nothing else happens that night. He finally passes out around 4 a.m. with the bat across his chest. Next morning, the storm's over. Sun's out, everything sparkles like a Christmas card. Ryan shovels the walk, half convinced he hallucinated the whole thing from too much MSG. The handprints are gone, melted away with the sunrise, no evidence. He almost manages to forget about it. Then December 21st rolls around. Winter solstice, shortest day of the year. Another storm, smaller but colder. -12 with the wind chill. Ryan's working late, headphones on, trying to patch some zero-day exploit for a client in California. Generators humming in the garage because the grid's still flaky from the last storm. 11:58 p.m. Knock! Knock! Same 2 knocks. Same spot. Same wet sound. This time, Ryan doesn't even hesitate. He's been waiting for it. He rips off the headphones, grabs the bat, and sprints to the front door. He's got all 3 cameras recording in 4K now, plus he set up a GoPro on a tripod in the foyer pointed straight at the entrance. He flings the door open, screaming, "What the hell do you want?" Empty. But this time, the handprints are back, fresh, steaming faintly in the sub-zero air. And there's frost on the inside of the storm door now, like someone exhaled against the glass from the outside. A perfect oval of fog with 2 tiny wet spots where lips touched. Ryan's losing it. He slams the inner door, locks it, and immediately checks the footage. Every camera shows the exact same thing. Empty porch, snow blowing, motion lights never trigger. But the GoPro inside catches something the others don't. At the exact moment of the second knock, there's a frame, just one single frame, where a figure is standing on the porch. Tall, way too tall, head almost touching the top of the doorframe. Skin the color of freezer-burned meat. No clothes. Eyes solid white like cataract blindness. Mouth open way too wide like the jaw unhinged. And its right hand is raised, knuckles forward, frozen mid-knock. Then the next frame, it's gone, like someone hit delete. Ryan uploads the clip to his cloud drive, sends it to 2 different friends with the message, "Tell me I'm not crazy." Both of them see the same single corrupted frame. One of them vomits. The other stops answering texts. That's when Ryan notices the temperature in the house is dropping. Fast. The thermostat is screaming, furnace running full blast, but the living room is down to 48 degrees and still falling. His breath is fogging. The Christmas tree lights start flickering even though they're on the generator circuit. He hears it again. Knock, knock. But this time, it's not the front door. It's coming from inside the house. 2 slow knocks on the basement door at the end of the hallway. Ryan lives alone. Has for 3 years. That basement door has been locked since he moved in because the previous owner left a bunch of creepy taxidermy down there he never bothered to throw out. The knocks come again. Slower. The wood actually flexes inward like something on the other side weighs 400 pounds. Ryan backs toward the kitchen, bat raised, phone in his other hand, trying to call 911. No signal, landline's dead, internet's down, he's completely cut off. The basement door handle starts to turn. Back and forth, real slow, like whatever's on the other side is figuring it out. Then, the voice. Not loud, just right behind his ear, even though he's 20 feet from the basement. "Let me in, Ryan. I'm so cold." Same voice from the single frame of video. Wet, like lungs full of snowmelt. Ryan does the only thing he can think of. He bolts upstairs, locks himself in the master bathroom, pushes the dresser against the door. He's shaking so hard he drops the phone in the toilet. He can hear it moving around downstairs now. Heavy, bare feet on hardwood. Slow. Patient. Opening and closing cabinets like it's looking for something. It climbs the stairs. You can hear every step creak under weight that shouldn't be possible. Knock, knock on the bathroom door. Ryan's crying silently, bat in both hands, waiting. The handle turns. The dresser scrapes an inch across the tile. Then, silence. 5 minutes. 10. 20. Eventually, Ryan passes out sitting against the tub, still clutching the bat. He wakes up at dawn, house is warm again, thermostat reads 67 degrees exactly, generator purring like nothing happened. Every door in the house is wide open. Front door, back door, basement door, All of them. Snow drifted 3 feet into the foyer. But there are no footprints coming in. There are footprints going out. 2 sets. One normal, size 10, Ryan's boots from when he ran upstairs. The other set, bare. Long, narrow, toes splayed. They start at the bathroom door, go down the stairs, across the living room, and out the front door into the snow. They walk straight down the driveway, across the cul-de-sac, and into the woods. They never come back. Ryan moved out 3 days later, left almost everything. The house is still on the market. Zillow listing says motivated seller. He sent me the GoPro footage. That single frame is still there. Every time I watch it, the figure looks a little bit closer to the lens. Some nights, when the temperature drops hard and fast, Ryan says he wakes up to 2 slow knocks on whatever apartment door he's renting now. He never answers. And he never, ever lets the thermostat go below 68 degrees again. I saw someone standing in the woods, then they split into 2. My name is Finn Harper, and I am cursed with too much clarity. I don't mean intelligence. I mean the kind of visual acuity that lets me spot a coyote pup moving half a mile away, or find a dropped earring in thick shag carpet. In my old life, this was an asset. I was a surveillance technician for a private security firm. In my new life, living in the dense, isolated woods of upstate Maine, a place I chose for the peace, not the observation, it became a liability. My eyes wouldn't let me ignore things. I live in a small, renovated firewatcher's cabin set back about 500 yards from a long, unused logging road. The nearest town is a place called Havenwood, and the name is a cruel joke. There's no haven here, just miles of granite, thick pine, and the kind of silence that tastes like dust and old snow. This story starts, as all the bad ones do, on a perfectly normal afternoon. It was mid-October. The air was crisp, smelling of peat and turning maple leaves. I was splitting kindling in my yard, focused entirely on the clean, rhythmic thwack of the axe head hitting the block. When I paused, catching my breath, I straightened up and looked toward the line of the woods. It was a habit, a residual tick from my surveillance days always checking the tree line. And that's when I saw it. There was a stand of white pines about 50 yards into the woods, a spot where the shadow was usually dense even at noon. Today, the sun was hitting the upper canopy, casting long, dark columns. Standing between 2 of those pines was a figure. It was tall, certainly 6 feet or more, and thin. It wore clothing that was difficult to discern, but it seemed uniform, a single color, perhaps a very dark gray or black. It was unnervingly still. No shift of weight, no movement of the arms, just a perfect upright column of stillness against the chaotic textures of the bark and needles. My first thought was that it was a hunter, despite it being 3 weeks before season. They shouldn't be on my property, but accidents happen. I was irritated, not scared. I raised my hand in a small half-wave, ready to yell out a greeting and a warning. The figure didn't respond. It didn't turn its head, didn't raise a hand. It just stood, facing my cabin, utterly motionless. I lowered my hand. My irritation began to curdle into unease. My superior eyesight, the curse, was confirming something that was beginning to feel profoundly wrong. If it was a person, why wasn't it reacting? Hunters are jumpy. Hikers are curious. I grabbed my binoculars from the porch table and focused them on the figure. The resolution snapped into clear, terrifying detail. It wasn't a person. The figure was indeed tall and thin, but its clothing wasn't fabric. It was a texture, a matte, dark surface that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The limbs, if they were limbs, were disproportionately long and spindly, and it had no face. Where a head should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless dome of the same light-absorbing material. It wasn't wearing a hood or a mask. The entire head was a continuous, bone-white surface blending seamlessly into the shoulders. It was facing me, but it had no eyes, no nose, no mouth to observe me with. Yet, I felt observed. I felt the cold, total focus of something that didn't need eyes to watch. I lowered the binoculars, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped them. I took a step back, the dry leaves under my boot making a loud crunch. The figure in the woods did not move its body, but I felt a change in the atmosphere. The woods suddenly went dead silent. The chatter of the squirrels, the distant call of a jay all vanished. Only the wind, whistling coldly through the pines, remained. Then, the impossible happened. As I watched, Frozen in a state of primal terror, the figure began to split. It didn't tear or divide in half. It started as a faint, vertical line that appeared right down the center of its body, from the top of the featureless dome to what I presumed were its feet. The line widened, slowly, agonizingly, like a zipper being pulled open on the universe. The material that composed the figure seemed to stretch and give way, pulling apart to reveal the space between. Within a span of maybe 30 seconds, the single figure had become two identical figures. They stood side by side, maybe a foot of pine needles and shadow separating them, perfect, terrifying mirror images of the single entity I had seen a minute before. They were both still, both featureless, both facing the cabin. I let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. This broke the trance. I dropped the binoculars, spun around, and ran. I slammed the heavy door of the cabin shut and threw every deadbolt and latch I had. I didn't stop until I was huddled in the corner of my small kitchen, hyperventilating, the axe still clutched in my hand. I forced myself to calm down, rationalizing the horror. Pareidolia, optical illusion, maybe a pair of trees or rock formations I hadn't noticed, but my mind rejected the comfort. I had seen them split. I had seen the impossible geometry of the division. I crept to the main window, keeping low, and peered out through a crack in the curtain. The two figures were still there, standing side by side, still motionless, still watching. I spent the rest of the day in a paralyzed state, watching the figures. They didn't move an inch. As the sun dropped, the shadows deepened, and the two figures slowly began to merge with the blackness of the woods. When I finally lost sight of them, swallowed by the absolute dark, a new fear took hold. They hadn't moved when they were visible. Where were they now that they were hidden? I stayed awake all night, rifle in my lap, listening to every creak of the old cabin. I heard nothing. The silence was perfect, deep, and menacing. The next morning, I was exhausted, but driven by a need for certainty. I had to know if they were gone. I waited until the sun was high enough to pierce the forest floor. I grabbed my rifle and cautiously unbolted the door. The air was clean and cold. The yard was empty. The tree line was just pines and shadows. I walked slowly, carefully, toward the spot where I had seen them. When I reached the two pines, I scanned the ground. My heart hammered against my ribs. There were no tracks, no snapped twigs, nothing to suggest a human or a deer or anything with weight had stood there. The pine needles were undisturbed. But right between the two pines, where the things had stood side by side, there was a patch of ground unlike the rest. The needles were pushed aside, and the dark, peaty earth was visible. In the center of the patch was a small, perfectly round hole. It was maybe 3 inches in diameter, and deep, too deep for a gopher or a snake. It looked like a probe had been driven straight into the ground. And around the lip of the hole, the peat was stained with a substance that was dark, glistening, and smelled faintly of rust and ozone. A metallic, coppery smell. I knelt, horrified, and looked closer at the stain. It was slick and viscous. I touched it with the tip of my axe. It was sticky, like tree sap, but warm. As I did, the hole began to vibrate. A faint, high-pitched whirring sound came up from the earth. The sound increased in volume, a mechanical, insect-like buzz. It made my teeth ache. I stumbled back, scrambling away from the vibration. I didn't wait. I turned and ran, convinced that the division I had witnessed was just the beginning of a larger, terrifying process of replication or worse, emergence. I drove the next day. I couldn't stay. I packed the bare minimum, rifle, cash, and the clothes on my back. I drove until I reached a small, quiet motel on the coast, miles and miles away from the dense inland woods. I thought I was safe. For 3 nights, I tried to sleep. I kept the curtains drawn, the television on for noise, and the lights burning. On the 4th night, I was watching some late-night news report when my attention drifted to the motel room window. The glass was old and slightly distorted. In the reflection, I saw something that shouldn't have been there. My room was brightly lit, but the reflection of the parking lot outside was unnervingly dark. And in the reflection, standing near the far end of the lot, was a familiar shape. Tall, thin, featureless. I spun around, looking at the actual window. The parking lot was well lit by a tall sodium vapor lamp. Only a few cars were parked there. No one was standing near the edge of the lot. Nothing was moving. I looked back at the reflection in the window. The figure was still there, facing the motel, facing my room. My heart began its frantic, desperate drumming. I wasn't just seeing things. The figures were somehow able to project their presence or their shadow only into reflective surfaces. They weren't physically there, but they were watching. I backed away from the window, grabbing my phone. I had to call someone. The police, a doctor, anyone. I scrolled through my contacts, my thumb hovering over the numbers. Then, the phone in my hand vibrated. It wasn't a call, it was a text message. It was from an unknown number. Just a single line of text. "We are done dividing." The text arrived at 1:17 a.m. I didn't respond. I simply dropped the phone onto the cheap carpet. I looked back at the window. The figure in the reflection hadn't moved. But then, as I watched, it did the division again. The line appeared down its center, slowly widening, but this time it didn't stop at 2. The 2 figures split into 4. The 4 figures split into 8. The multiplication happened silently, seamlessly, until the entire reflection of the parking lot was filled with dozens of these tall, pale, featureless columns. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a silent, unnerving crowd of unnatural watchers. And then, one of the reflected figures, one of the last ones to divide, raised a spindly arm. It didn't wave, it didn't point. It made a gesture that looked chillingly familiar. A long, slender finger slowly traced the shape of my window in the reflection. And as the figure traced the glass, I heard a faint, high-pitched scritch coming from the window pane behind me. Not in the reflection. In reality, I turned slowly. Etched into the surface of the motel window, just barely visible in the faint light, was a perfect, continuous circle. It wasn't scratched into the glass. It was burned. The glass inside the circle was clouded and warped, like a fever blister on the eye of the window. They weren't just in the reflection. They had used the glass as a focus, a lens. And then the circle began to expand. Slowly, silently, the ring of warped glass spread outward, eating up the clear pane like a droplet of ink blooming on paper. The scritching sound grew louder, a grating, terrible sound of matter being violated. I didn't wait for the circle to engulf the window. I didn't wait for the glass to break. I grabbed my rifle and ran out of the room, leaving the lights burning, leaving the phone with its cryptic message. I drove all night, east, toward the rising sun and the ocean. I am now on a fishing trawler, 30 miles off the coast of New Brunswick. I have been at sea for 3 weeks. I sleep in a small, cramped cabin with no windows, only a single steel hatch. I keep my rifle and axe ready. But sometimes, when I step out onto the deck at night and look at the vast, featureless expanse of the dark, reflective ocean water, I catch a glimpse of a familiar, pale column standing at the distant edge of the reflection. And I know they are still dividing. They are still watching. And that whatever impossible, unnatural intelligence stands in the woods or travels through reflections is not satisfied with 2 or 4 or 8. It is a contagion of pure, cold observation. And all I can do is keep moving, hoping that the movement, the noise, the sheer chaos of human civilization is enough to keep the reflected, splitting horror from finally reaching across the void. I am cursed with clarity. And I know, with terrible certainty, that they are not just watching me anymore. They are watching the sea. They are watching the sky. And one day soon, the reflection will be too full, and the circle will finally burst. This story continues the trend of intense, isolated horror, focusing on the violation of a personal, intimate space, the bedroom, with an unsettling, unexplained phenomenon that uses a symbol of innocence, the snow angel, to convey profound terror. The snow angels that appeared around my bed. My life, post-encounter, became a series of desperate attempts to rebuild the illusion of safety. After leaving the mountains, after leaving the coast, I settled, if you can call it that, in the flat, anonymous heartland of Nebraska. No woods, no large bodies of water for reflections, just endless fields of dormant corn and sky. I rented a small, one-story farmhouse on a plot of land where the closest neighbor was a mile away, separated by a noisy highway. The house was structurally sound, with thick plaster walls and small, secure windows. I installed heavy blackout curtains and bolted the doors. I was paranoid, yes, but after what I'd seen, paranoia was just caution. It was mid-December. The weather had been bitterly cold but oddly dry. Then, one Tuesday, the snow came. It didn't flurry. It just descended a blizzard that swallowed the world whole, dropping nearly 2 feet in 6 hours. I should have felt safe. The snow was a barrier. It stopped the traffic on the highway and muffled every sound. I was warm inside, the scent of burning logs heavy in the air, watching the pristine white landscape blur outside my windows. I went to bed early that night, around 9 p.m. My bedroom was small, located in the very center of the house, away from the exterior walls. I slept on a single mattress on the floor, another rule I'd adopted: stay low, minimize exposure. I fell into the deep, exhausted sleep of a man running on fumes. And then I woke up. It wasn't a sudden jolt. It was a slow, agonizing slide out of unconsciousness, triggered by the profound sense that I was not alone. The air in the room was colder than it should have been, and it carried a faint, sweet smell like fresh-cut pine mixed with something sharp like frozen metal. I opened my eyes. It was pitch black. I reached for the high-powered flashlight I kept beneath my pillow. I flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, anchoring on the foot of my bed. I screamed. Not a cinematic shout, but a thick, strangled gasp of pure, animalistic terror. The light revealed that I was encircled. Around my mattress, maybe 3 feet from the edge of my blanket, the floor was covered in a pristine layer of snow. Not dust, not powder, but actual fresh outdoor snow. It ringed my bed in a perfect circle about 6 inches deep, confined entirely to the space surrounding my mattress. And in that circle of impossible indoor snow were 7 snow angels. They were perfectly formed. The arms swept wide, the impressions of the heads were clear, the legs were pressed into the snow in a motion of playful, innocent joy. They looked exactly like the ones children make, except they weren't in a field. They were 6 inches from my head on the oak floorboards of my sealed, locked room. There were 7 of them, all facing the bed, all forming a silent, terrifying audience around me. My mind shattered instantly. How? How did the snow get in? How did the things that made the angels get in and out? My window was closed, double locked, and covered by thick, heavy blackout curtains. I scrambled back against the headboard, the flashlight beam shaking wildly. The snow was cold. I could feel the frigid air wafting off the circle. I noticed 2 impossible details immediately. First, the impression of the wings. The movements were too perfect, too smooth. There were no edges, no individual finger marks, no signs of clothing. Folds the wings and bodies were just immaculate, continuous depressions in the snow. They were made by shapes that were utterly fluid, not human. Second, the silence. If someone had broken in, if they had brought in snow and made 7 complex shapes, the noise would have been tremendous. But the house was silent, muffled by the blizzard outside, but silent inside. I pointed the flashlight at the curtained window. No break. I shined it toward the heavy oak door. Bolted. Then I noticed the 8th angel. It wasn't on the floor. It was on the ceiling. Directly above me, where the beam of the flashlight landed, the dark plaster ceiling was covered in a thin, pale frost. And carved into that frost, in perfect, frozen white, was an 8th snow angel. It was upside down, arms and legs extended, the frost impression looking like a pale, inverted negative of the angels on the floor. And from the center of that ceiling angel, from the spot where its face should have been, there was a single drop of something clear and viscous, slowly forming. The drop fell. I saw it glitter in the flashlight beam, and then it landed on the center of my forehead. It was warm. Horribly, unnervingly warm. I screamed again, scrambling off the mattress and tumbling into the circle of snow. The cold shock brought me back to a desperate, frantic clarity. I grabbed my rifle, checking the chamber by touch. The silence of the house seemed to press down on me, urging me back into the terror. I aimed the rifle at the ceiling angel, at the warm spot where the drop had fallen. I wanted to blast the ceiling open, to break the awful perfection of the scene. But then, a movement caught my eye. One of the snow angels on the floor, the one closest to the door, subtly changed. The impression of the left arm, the wing, wasn't quite right. It was too long, too straight. And then I realized why. The impression of the arm was extending. The impression in the snow was deepening, lengthening, pushing past the initial sweep, stretching out toward the door with agonizing slowness. It was like watching a time lapse of something moving, except it was happening in real time. The angel wasn't an impression left by a body. It was a mold for a transformation. The arm impression reached the door, and then the snow in that area shuddered. It didn't melt or fall apart. It compacted. The snow compacted into a dense, solid, white approximation of a hand resting against the base of the door. And then, the solidified snow hand began to climb the wood, inch by excruciating inch, moving toward the deadbolt. I didn't hesitate this time. I raised the rifle and aimed for the center of the figure's body. Blam! The shot was deafening. The roar of the rifle echoed off the thick walls. The sound of the blast was so violent, it momentarily displaced the cold. Where the snow angel had been, there was now a plume of fine white powder and splintered floorboards. The bullet had torn through the oak, ripping a hole into the empty crawl space below. But the snow hand was still on the door. It hadn't been touched. The sound of the shot was my only warning. As the white powder settled, I heard the rapid, soft sound of padding coming from the rest of the circle. I turned the flashlight beam back around. All 6 remaining angels were moving. Their impressions were deepening, solidifying. The snow wasn't falling apart. It was compacting, becoming dense, rigid, taking on the smooth, pale contours of the figures I had seen in the woods. And as they solidified, the sound of the padding came from their hands, which were now perfectly formed, pale white, and resting on the floor. They were patting the wood, rhythmically, sweetly, like a child patting a pet. The patting turned into the sound of soft, wet sniffing. A collective, low-grade inhalation that seemed to draw the air right out of the room. My rifle was now aimed at 6 solidifying entities, which were still prone, still in the shape of the angels, but no longer just snow. They were pale, cold, and utterly solid. I fired again, hitting the closest figure, the one next to where my feet had been. Blam! The entity didn't shatter. The bullet hit the dense, snow-white material, and the impact point glowed with a sickening blue light. The light pulsed once, twice, and then vanished. The figure was unscratched. It was resistant to normal rounds. They weren't made of ice or snow. They were made of something cold, solid, and completely alien. The figure I shot raised its head, turning its featureless dome towards me. It hadn't moved its body. The head simply rotated on the snowpack neck, a smooth, silent turn. It looked at me with an observation that transcended sight. Then, from the center of its solid, pale body came a whisper. It was high, sweet, and perfectly clear. "We missed you, Elias." It knew my former name, the name I had abandoned in the mountains, the name I had told no one in Nebraska. I scrambled backward until my back hit the wall. The snow angels were not just surrounding my bed, they had followed me. They were using the image of childhood innocence, the snow angel, to mock the vulnerability of sleep, and they had found the way in. The realization hit me. The warm drop from the ceiling. It wasn't water. It was a sample. They needed something from me to confirm the location, and then they used the blizzard to cover their work, bringing the snow in through the smallest possible opening, perhaps a vent or a chimney flue, to stage the scene. The 6 solid figures simultaneously began to sit up. It was an unnatural, jerky movement. Their limbs didn't bend at the joints. Their torsos simply hinged upward, maintaining the cold, pale geometry of their shapes. One of them, the closest, reached out its pale, dense hand and touched the floorboards. The wood immediately turned black and began to smoke, releasing a high, whining sound. They were melting the house around me, not with heat, but with an intense, localized alien cold. I knew I couldn't fight them. I couldn't shoot them. My only choice was to break the ritual, to break the circle. I lunged for the center of the room, raising the axe I had brought in with me. I slammed the heavy maul down onto the nearest perfect snow angel. Crack! I didn't hit the solidified figure. I swung the maul into the circle of snow, tearing a wide, messy trench through the pristine white carpet. The effect was instantaneous. The 6 seated figures froze. The one at the door stopped moving. The whine of the burning wood ceased. The perfect circle had been broken. The spell, or the focus, was shattered. The pale figures began to crumble. They didn't melt or dissolve, they collapsed inward, turning from solid, dense material back into fine, sterile snow powder. They fell onto the floor with a soft, collective hush. In moments, the room was empty, save for the scattering of cold white powder, the stench of ozone and burnt wood, and the gaping hole in my floor where I had shot the rifle. I stood there, gasping, the maul heavy in my hands. The air was frigid, the silence of the blizzard absolute. I knew then that I could never outrun the mountains, the reflections, or the things that made perfect, mocking gestures in the snow. They were not just following me, They were adapting, using the geometry of my safe spaces against me. I walked to the window, pulled back the blackout curtain, and looked out at the blizzard. The world was a white, featureless sheet. Then I looked down at the snow covering my front porch. It was untouched, pristine. But there, pressed into the snow right against the door jamb, was a single, perfect child's handprint. It was small, soft, and utterly alone. They didn't break in. They didn't need to. They materialized inside the house, staged the terror, and left a single, final calling card on the outside. I dropped the axe and the rifle. I walked out of the house, out into the raging blizzard, leaving the door unlocked, leaving the lights on. I didn't get into my car. I just started walking toward the highway, toward the sound of the unseen world. I am still walking. I no longer seek refuge. I seek movement. Because I know that the moment I stop, the moment I sleep, the moment I give them an unbroken line of sight or an unbroken circle of space, the snow will find a way in, and the angels will be waiting, closer this time, ready to acknowledge the man they've been searching for. I'm Finn Harper, and I'm done answering the door. The thing crawling on my roof at negative 20 degrees Celsius. After I left the Nebraska farmhouse, I traded shelter for momentum. I became a creature of transit. I purchased an old, heavily insulated fifth-wheel RV, a bulky, noisy, self-contained unit, and I drove. I chose the coldest, most desolate routes I could find, aiming for the deep freeze of the Northern Rockies in late winter. I figured if the things thrived on stillness and reflection, they would hate the chaos of constant movement and the obliterating effect of sub-zero temperatures. I was wrong. The cold didn't stop them. It just refined their methods. The event happened 10 days ago during a brutal cold snap near the Canadian border. The temperature gauge in the RV read -28, circ text C $outside, and the wind chill made it feel like the air itself was sharding into ice splinters. I was parked in an emergency pull-off, a small, graveled crescent of concrete that hadn't seen a snowplow in days, tucked against a wall of bare, frozen rock. I kept the diesel engine running 24 hours a day. The constant rumble of the generator and the heater fan was my new white noise, my auditory armor against the terrifying silence. I was drinking lukewarm coffee, watching the weather reports scroll across my laptop screen, my only connection to the living world, when I heard the sound. It was faint at first, barely audible over the roaring of the RV's machinery, a sound like fingernails dragging across the fiberglass and aluminum skin of the RV's roof. Scrape. Scrape. I froze. My entire body tensed, the hot coffee cooling instantly in my stomach. The generator was deafening. The fan was loud. Yet, the sound was distinct. It was right above my head. Scrape! Then a small, soft thump. Something was on my roof. Something heavy enough to register a thump, but light enough to scrape without leaving a visible dent. My mind started cycling through logical explanations. A large owl landing, an ice sheet cracking, a frozen tree branch falling. But I was parked against rock, well away from the pines. And the scraping was too deliberate, too organized. I grabbed my rifle and crept to the small, thick glass window by the kitchen counter. It was covered in a crust of hard frost, impossible to see through. I wiped a small, clear patch with my sleeve. Outside, everything was blue-white and immobile. The rock face behind the RV was a wall of black ice. The air was dead, hanging perfectly still in the extreme cold. Nothing was visible on the ground. But then, the sound changed. The scraping stopped. It was replaced by a soft, repeated thudding, heavier this time, moving methodically from the front of the RV toward the back, right above my head. Thud, thud, thud. It sounded like someone, or something, was crawling on all fours across the roof, using deliberate, rhythmic movements. It was covering the entire length of the RV, a total of 35 feet, in slow, measured steps. The terror was amplified by the extreme cold. The roof wasn't just fiberglass, it was covered in a thick layer of rock-hard, wind-blown snow and ice. To move like that on all fours without slipping or falling would require grip, weight, and a physical structure that defied the slick surface. The thudding stopped directly over my bedroom, located in the rear of the RV. Silence. The most terrifying sound in the world. Then, a new sound began. A soft, high-pitched chirping. It sounded like a frozen insect struggling. It was faint, metallic, and seemed to be coming from the ventilation stack directly above my head. The sound vibrated through the metal frame of the RV, turning the whole structure into a massive resonating drum. The chirping repeated itself 3 long pulses, followed by 1 short one. A pattern. I had to see it. I had to know what impossible geometry, what terrible form was currently resting inches above my skull in the lethal cold. My only access to the roof was the main skylight in the kitchen area. It was a thick, double-paned acrylic dome, currently buried under half a foot of snow and ice. I crept back to the kitchen, climbed onto the counter, and stared up at the opaque dome. I could hear the generator roaring directly beneath me, trying to maintain the internal temperature. I focused on the underside of the dome. Due to the warmth from inside, there was a small gap between the acrylic and the external ice layer. As I stared, a black spot appeared in that gap. It was tiny, maybe the size of a quarter, and perfectly circular. It was not a shadow. It was the absence of light, a small, dark hole pressed against the outer layer of the acrylic. And then the black spot grew. It expanded slowly, silently, pushing the ice and snow layer out of the way. It wasn't scratching the acrylic, it was displacing the frozen water with a localized intense heat or pressure. Within seconds, the black spot was the size of a dinner plate, and now I could see through it. What I saw was the underside of the thing. It was not round or flat. It was a dense, matted cluster of dark, needle-like appendages, all packed tightly together, radiating out from a single, dark center. It looked like a cluster of frozen black pine needles glued together by some dark resin, forming a massive star-shaped disc. It was this dark, dense cluster that was pressed against the roof, acting as both foot and eye. The scraping had been the needles finding purchase on the frozen surface. The thudding was the heavy, compacted weight of the center moving forward. As I watched, horrified, the entire structure pulsed. It didn't beat like a heart. It compressed and expanded, like a lens focusing. And as it pulsed, a sudden, blinding flash of white light erupted from the center of the dark cluster right onto the acrylic dome. The light was pure, surgical white, so intense that for a second, I thought I'd gone blind. It lasted only a microsecond, but it was enough. The light burned a perfect 3-inch wide ring into the acrylic, clouding the plastic and leaving a distinct, sharp outline. The light was focused, penetrating the thick roof. And then I heard the sound again, but this time it was inside my head. The chirping. The 3 long pulses, 1 short one. But with the blast of light, the pattern of chirping had changed. It was replaced by the cold, clear sound of a woman weeping. A sound of raw, desperate human grief ringing inside my skull, so immediate and intense that I dropped off the counter, clutching my ears. The weeping was not auditory, it was emotional. It was a wave of pure, paralyzing sorrow that crashed over me, paralyzing my will, draining all warmth and resolve. It was meant to immobilize me. I forced myself to crawl back up, my mind reeling from the shock of the sound attack. I looked back through the scorched hole in the skylight. The cluster was gone. The dark, dense mass had retracted. All that remained was the perfect white-hot ring burned into the acrylic. And then I saw the residue. Where the center of the pulsating cluster had been, a patch of the roof's white ice layer was melted, and floating in the puddle of water were dozens of small white objects. They looked like tiny, perfectly formed teeth, not human, not animal. They were uniform, smooth, and blunt, the same pattern of molars I had seen in the ground mouth in the woods, only miniature. They were shedding them, leaving them as calling cards. I scrambled away from the skylight, backing into the rear of the RV, towards the little bedroom where the figure had stopped thudding. I was shaking uncontrollably, the interior temperature of the RV feeling like tropical heat compared to the sheer cold terror radiating off the roof. The chirping started again, louder this time, coming from the vent stack right above the bed. Chirp, 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 chirp. It was faster now, more frantic. I heard a sudden, sharp crack from the exterior of the RV. Then another. I knew what it was. The extreme cold outside was causing the metal and fiberglass to contract violently. The entity had focused its attention on one area, the vent stack, and the localized stress was causing the RV to fail. The final, shattering sound came from the vent itself. With a sound like tearing aluminum, the entire vent cover was ripped open. And then the chirping stopped. I heard a heavy hissing sound, the sound of cold air pouring into the confined space, along with the grinding noise of the generator trying to compensate. I looked up. The small ventilation grill in the bedroom ceiling was gone. It was a clean, black hole leading straight up to the dark night and the thing on the roof. And then something dropped through the hole. Not the entire creature, just a single, long, pale needle. It was about a foot long, thin as a knitting needle, and completely white. It landed silently on my pillow. The needle was vibrating, and from its tip, a small, clear drop of liquid formed. It wasn't water, it wasn't warm, it was thick, viscous, and completely transparent. It looked like pure, high-grade ether. The drop landed on the blanket, and where it landed, the synthetic fiber instantly hardened, turning into a brittle frozen crust. The needle was the focus. It was a way to channel the negative 28 degrees Celsius into my warm, protected space. I grabbed the needle with a pair of pliers I kept nearby and tossed it into the sink. The porcelain instantly cracked with the cold shock. I knew this was the end of the line. The RV wasn't a fortress, it was a pressurized can, and the cold was their tool for penetration. They didn't need to break in the door. They only needed to break the temperature barrier. I put the RV in drive. I didn't care about the snow, the ice, or the state troopers. I slammed the accelerator to the floor, the heavy vehicle lurching forward, tires spinning wildly on the ice. As the RV screamed onto the highway, the thing on the roof, the cold, pulsing cluster, did one last thing. It slammed its weight onto the roof with a final, massive dump. The impact jarred the entire vehicle, and from the hole in the ceiling, along with the chilling air, came the sound I had dreaded most. A loud, clear, echoing laugh. Not the child's giggle or the woman's weeping, a deep, cold, malevolent laugh that was neither human nor animal. A laugh of total, absolute triumph. I drove until the generator failed. The engine sputtered, and the RV slid into a ditch 20 miles down the road. I stumbled out, freezing, into the dead of night, leaving the cold, laughing thing on the roof behind. I am writing this now, in a remote logging camp, pretending to be a cook. I am never still. I am never quiet. The air conditioning is always set to maximum, the radio is always on full volume, and I never, ever look up. Because I know the thing that crawls on the roof isn't after my life. It's after my heat. It's after the small, vital warmth of human consciousness, which, to these cold, multiplying entities, is the most delicious form of energy. I am Elias Vance, and I am freezing. And the laughter is fading, turning into a soft, high-pitched chirping that seems to be coming from the insulation in the walls. And I know they've found my final warmth. Last transmission from Cabin 6, the longest night. The static and the silence. The wind on the Alaskan tundra doesn't howl, it screams, a thin, metallic shriek that strips the heat from your bones and clarity from your mind. It was this sound, mixed with the monotonous hiss of static, that was the final companion of Officer Thomas, Tom Rourke. Tom sat hunched in the communications shack of the Denali National Park outpost, the green glow of the receiver, his only defense against the crushing, impenetrable darkness outside. The blizzard, an unholy fusion of ice and wind, had locked down the entire interior for 3 days. The air hung thick with the smell of stale coffee, damp wool, and the nervous tension that always precedes a truly deep cold. His fingers, stiff despite the thermal gloves, hovered over the transcript. The last communication he had received, hours ago, before the primary relay station went down, was a fragmented, desperate cry for help. Tom ran a trembling hand over his face, scraping a day's worth of stubble. 2 men in Cabin 6, Ben and Dr. Elias Thorne. Now, just the static and the memory of that final, chilling, repetitive thump. The outpost rules were clear. During a level 5 blizzard, no rescue attempts. But Tom had heard that scream. He'd heard the whisper in the wind. And he knew, with the cold certainty of a man facing the true North Wilderness, that if he waited until the storm broke, all he would find at Cabin 6 would be 2 frozen corpses and a mystery that would drive him mad. He strapped on his extreme weather gear, grabbed the satellite phone, low power, limited use, a flare gun, and the standard issue Mossberg 500, just in case Too Big had a hide he couldn't pierce. Part I. The walk into the white. The absence of snowfall. Stepping outside was like plunging into an abyss of razor wire. The wind immediately attacked any exposed skin, promising frostbite in minutes. The outpost, his only sanctuary, was swallowed instantly by the swirling void. Tom activated the mounted helmet lamp. It cut a weak, tunnel-like beam through the whiteout, illuminating only the closest few feet of the ground. Navigation was impossible by sight. He relied on the old-fashioned, buried guide wire that stretched between the main outpost and the 6 research cabins, a line that was now covered by a mountain of fresh, compacted snow. He found the wire with his gloved hands, following it like a blind man tracing Braille. The distance to Cabin 6 was roughly 3 miles. In these conditions, it could take 4 hours. Every step was a battle. The snowdrifts came up past his waist, forcing him to high step and burn through his energy reserves at a terrifying rate. After what felt like an hour, something snagged his boot. He stumbled, catching himself before he fell into a drift. He shone the lamp down. It wasn't the guide wire, it was Ben's body. The first moment was shock. The second was a sickening wave of comprehension. Ben had not just gone for the fuel line. He was lying face down, frozen solid into a grotesque kneeling posture. His hands were clasped over the back of his neck, a pose of abject defense. Tom knelt, ignoring the stinging cold that seeped into his knee pads. He reached for the body, intending to turn it over, but his hand stopped inches away. The back of Ben's parka was not torn. It wasn't ripped by claws. It was peeled away. The thick, insulated fabric had been meticulously separated from the lining, sliced with surgical precision around the shoulders and spine. And beneath, where the skin of his neck and upper back should have been, there was nothing but a hollow, concave depression of frozen meat. Ben's spinal column was gone. Extracted. Not torn out violently, but removed with the same care one might use to core an apple. The edges of the wound were cauterized by the deep cold, but Tom could see the clean severance of the nerve endings. "Jesus Christ," Tom whispered, the sound immediately stolen by the wind. Not a predator. Not an animal. This was an act of terrible, deliberate efficiency, something that hunted not for sustenance, but for something specific and small inside the shell of a man. He stood up, heart hammering against his ribs. The Mossberg suddenly felt inadequate, a plastic toy against a nightmare built of ice and flesh. He didn't have time for analysis. The clock was ticking for Dr. Thorne. He had to keep moving. He left Ben a monument of silent terror and followed the guide wire, now more of a chain, to a horror he couldn't name. The sound of sandpaper. Tom had walked for another 2 hours. The blizzard hadn't diminished, but the quality of the sound had changed. The high-pitched scream of the wind was now underscored by a low, grating sound, like massive sheets of sandpaper being rubbed together. "It's the ice," he rationalized. The wind dragging the pack ice over the rock face. But the sound was too rhythmic, too close. It didn't belong to the impersonal, chaotic fury of the storm. He stopped, pulling the scarf down over his mouth to listen better. The static in his comms unit was a comforting blanket of white noise compared to the utter vacuum of sound in the lull of the wind. Grind. Scrape. Pause. Grind. Scrape. Pause. It was coming from ahead of him, on the same bearing as Cabin 6. He kept his lamp trained on the guide wire. His boot hit something metallic. A gas can. The one Ben had been retrieving. It was dented, but intact. Not tossed aside by a struggle, but deliberately placed, like a marker. Suddenly, the scraping stopped. The silence that followed was so profound it felt like a pressure against his eardrums. Tom raised the shotgun, pumping the action a loud, metallic schlick-schlack that felt horribly reckless in the vast silence. And then, he heard the whisper. It was faint, but undeniably human. It wasn't carried by the wind. It seemed to originate inside his helmet, a dry, papery sound like an old man sighing into a microphone. "Domas!" Tom froze. His name. Whispered, not shouted, not in a panicked scream, but spoken with the intimacy of a lover and the coldness of a tombstone. "Show yourself!" he yelled, the shout barely making it past the thick lining of his hood. The whispering came again, closer. "You shouldn't have come." The hair on his arms stood up. This wasn't a man in the snow. This was a performance. A terrifying display of mockery. He fired the flare gun, sending a blinding magnesium-white beacon arching into the sky. For one agonizing second, the brilliant light pierced the whiteout, revealing the outline of Cabin 6 just 50 feet away. And for that same second, the flare illuminated something else. A shape. It stood hunched over the main entrance, massive, maybe 10 feet tall, its silhouette impossible to define. It wasn't bulky like a bear, it was elongated, slender, and seemed to be draped in long, heavy strands of ice and snow like a forgotten statue. Its head, or what Tom assumed was its head, was tipped toward the light, and he saw, with a horror that rooted him to the spot, that its texture was not fur or hide, but a glistening, black chitin layered over with centuries of frozen rime. Most sickeningly, the flare caught the two enormous compound eyes, a chaotic, multifaceted crimson that looked like rubies shattered and reformed inside a frozen block of pitch. The creature didn't move fast. It simply began to pivot, slowly, toward the sound of the flare. Tom dropped the flare gun, brought the Mossberg to his shoulder, and fired 3 times into the center mass of the silhouette. The roar of the shotgun was deafening. The creature didn't cry out. It didn't fall. It simply shuddered a massive, rippling convulsion that sent a shower of ice chips flying. The bullets, meant to stop a charging grizzly, had no visible effect. The crimson eyes locked onto him. Tom saw, in the deep facets of those eyes, the reflected image of himself. Small, desperate, and utterly alone. Then the blizzard swallowed the flare. Darkness returned, more absolute than before. Tom didn't wait. He ran, blindly, the last 50 feet toward the only shelter available, Cabin 6. Elias Thorne's gift. Tom hit the reinforced door of Cabin 6 like a wrecking ball. The locking mechanism, a thick steel bar, was still bolted from the inside. Elias Thorne was alive. "Thorne! Elias! It's Rourke! Open the damn door now!" Tom pounded, his breath coming in ragged, ice-cold gasps. Inside, he heard a shuffle. Then a low, exhausted voice. "Tom! Oh God, Tom, don't! Don't open the bar! It'll be the death of us both!" "The hell I won't! Thorne, I saw it! It's right behind me!" "It doesn't matter! It's not in a hurry, Rourke! Listen to me!" Tom stopped pounding. Thorne's voice was the voice of a man who had already accepted his fate. A chilling calm that bespoke utter defeat. "What is it, Thorne? What did you find out there?" "It's not out there," Thorne whispered, the sound muffled by the thick door. "It came with the core samples. We dug too deep, Tom. We tapped something that should have stayed frozen for the next 1,000 years. It doesn't hunt, Rourke. It mines." "That thing!" It took Ben's spine. Because that's where the neurological relay is strongest. The human self. It's taking the data, and it's learning how to speak. The scraping sound returned, closer this time, just past the small high window, the sound of chitin against frozen wood. "Thorne, open the door now, or I'll blow the lock. I'm your only chance." "No, I can't. But listen, Tom, I have something for you." A faint, high-pitched whining started inside the cabin, quickly building into a deafening, resonant frequency that vibrated through the steel door. Tom clapped his hands over his helmeted ears. "What the hell are you doing?" "Ben's research. He was working on an ultra-low-frequency sonic disruptor. We found that it hates the frequency of 0-degree air molecular vibration. It confuses it. It makes it slow." "I only have a minute of battery!" Thorne screamed over the whine. "Go, Rourke, run! Don't stop for anything! And listen to the wire." "What wire?" "The guide wire, you idiot. It's not a guide wire. It's the power conduit for the entire geothermal research array. It's shielded. It's pumping a tiny, tiny current. It's the only thing that can touch it." The whine peaked, then violently cut out, replaced by the sound of a struggle inside the cabin, a terrifying mix of tearing metal and a strangled, gurgling plea. Then, the final, dreadful noise. The door bar tearing out of the wood frame. Tom turned and ran. He ran back into the whiteout, the heavy Mossberg suddenly useless in his hands. He ran, not toward the outpost, but off the path, driven by Thorne's final cryptic message. Listen to the wire. Part 2. The conduit. 4. Following the signal, Tom plunged headlong into the drifts, leaving the relative safety of the guide wire's path. The massive screeching, a sound of frustrated, inhuman rage, erupted from the open doorway of Cabin 6 behind him. He was running blind, praying the dense blizzard provided enough cover to shield him from the monstrous eyes. Listen to the wire. He remembered the layout of the geothermal grid. The guide wire followed the path of the primary power conduit, which led not to the outpost, but another 2 miles past the outpost, where it hooked up to a small, decommissioned radio tower that used to power the satellite uplink for the entire Denali region. The tower was old, barely standing, and supposedly unpowered. But what if it wasn't? What if the scientists had jury-rigged a power drain from the geothermal research equipment? He scrambled through the snow, using the low-frequency static from the defunct comms unit to try and track the buried conduit. It was a faint, almost non-existent hum beneath the noise of the storm. Tom had one objective: reach the radio tower. He found the conduit near a frozen stream bed, a thicker braided cable, not a simple wire. He fell onto it, clutching the cable with both hands, trying to absorb some of the frantic energy and misplaced scientific curiosity of the men who had laid it. The whisper returned. Now, it was directly behind him, closer than before. Data. Collection. Incomplete. Thomas. You have the memories. End quote. The creature was hunting him by sound, but also by some other, deeper sense. Could it feel his fear? Could it sense the electromagnetic interference of his beating heart? He imagined the black chitin, slick with ice, sliding through the snow. He imagined the broken ruby eyes, calculating the angle of his spine, the weight of his fear. He clutched the cable tighter. Thorn had said the current was tiny, but enough to confuse it. He crawled along the conduit for what felt like an eternity, the whisper tracking him like a predator on a scent trail. 5. The tower's embrace. Finally, through the snow, he saw the faint, skeletal silhouette of the old radio tower. It was a rusting tripod, impossibly tall, its antenna snapped by some forgotten storm. As Tom dragged himself toward the base, the whispering suddenly intensified, becoming a chilling cacophony of multiple voices. Ben, Ben, Ben. Thorn, Thorn, let us teach you. Thomas, we will make you whole. It had synthesized the voices of the 2 dead men. It was using their final moments of terror to break his will. Tom reached the base of the tower. A small square junction box was attached to one of the rusty legs, the termination point of the geothermal conduit. The box, Tom knew, held a series of high-voltage capacitors meant to smooth out the power line for the now-defunct uplink. The creature was now 50 feet away, a massive, shifting darkness in the storm. Tom pulled the Mossberg from his sling, abandoning it. He needed his hands free. He pulled out the multi-tool from his belt and slammed it into the lock of the junction box. The cheap lock snapped. Inside, the capacitors were humming a high-pitched buzz that confirmed Thorn's frantic theory. They were charged not by the grid, but by the minute electrical flow of the geothermal conduit, storing energy. The creature stopped its approach. It was sensitive to the frequency the buzzing was disorienting it. It began to rake the ground with one of its long, thin, chitinous limbs, sending arcs of snow flying. Tom reached inside the box, his thermal glove protecting him from the relatively low voltage. He was looking for a specific wire, the main conduit to the ground rod. The whispering stopped. The creature let out a low, guttural moan, a sound of confusion, not pain. Wrong frequency. It was learning. It understood the principles of the energy. Tom found the thick copper ground wire, stripped of its insulation, where it entered the box. He had to draw the current out and use it as a weapon. He pulled out the flare from his pack. He didn't fire it. Instead, he wrapped the copper wire around the magnesium casing of the flare. Magnesium is a highly reactive metal, and the flare's powder would be a decent conductor. The creature began to move again, a terrifying, purposeful stride. Tom could see the multifaceted eyes focusing, resolving on the small, frantic human at the base of the tower. "It's not the frequency you hate!" Tom screamed, his voice raw with adrenaline. "It's the power! The life you crave!" The creature raised a limb. It looked like a massive, serrated blade of ice. It was going to strike. Tom finished the jury rig, copper wire wrapped around the flare. He shoved the flare into the junction box, connecting the ground wire to the positive terminal of the largest humming capacitor. He let out a final, primal yell. "Dendrite discharge! You son of a bitch!" 6. The longest night. A blinding, crackling blue arc of energy erupted from the junction box, following the line of the copper wire and channeling directly into the magnesium flare. The flare ignited with a furious, instantaneous flash, but it wasn't just a flash of light. The electrical surge traveled through the flare's conductive material, creating a massive, unstable electrical discharge that instantly vaporized the moisture in the air. The air around the radio tower became a sphere of brilliant, destructive blue light. The creature, its eyes adjusted to the pitch black, recoiled instantly from the overwhelming photon explosion. The discharge, amplified by the tower's own capacitance, surged out, a chaotic bolt of lightning seeking the nearest conductor. And the nearest conductor was the creature's own chitinous body. Chitin, Tom knew, is not naturally a good conductor. But the creature's thick layer of black metallic rime, the thousands of years of frozen moisture and mineral deposits, was. The electrical discharge hit the creature's chest mass with an audible crackwoom. The massive figure didn't collapse. It didn't burn. Instead, the entire massive shape began to violently contort. The black carapace glowed bright red, then white, then shattered, flying outwards in glittering shards of frozen metal. A smell of burnt copper and ozone filled the air. The creature let out a final sound, not a roar, not a scream, but a high-pitched, vibrating sound of pure, unadulterated static, the sound of a million thoughts being erased at once. The crimson eyes, the terrible, knowing eyes, instantly went dull, turning into two opaque, frozen balls of ice. The creature collapsed. A massive, hollow husk of shattered, frozen exoskeleton the size of a small car. It hit the ground with a soft, final thud that the wind immediately began to cover with snow. The blue light faded. The storm still raged, but the whispering was gone. The silence was back, cold and absolute. Tom stood, trembling, his hands scorched by the feedback surge, his body aching from the cold. He looked down at the husk of the thing that had killed Ben and Thorne. It was nothing. Just a shell, a biological drill that had bored its way into the world to steal the purest form of information, the self. Tom picked up his forgotten Mossberg, the weight a reassurance against the lingering terror. He didn't look back at the cabin or the remains of the creature. He simply turned and started the long, cold walk back toward the outpost, the guiding wire, now truly just a guide, leading him away from the longest night of his life. He was alive. He was whole. And he carried the terrible knowledge of the thing that lies waiting, frozen deep beneath the tundra, waiting for the warm, pulsing light of human consciousness to return to the surface. The only transmission Tom Rourke ever sent about the incident was a single cryptic line. Cabin 6 secured, cause of death, extreme cold, recommend permanent isolation of grid quadrant. The truth, like the chitinous monster, was buried deep, waiting for the next long night and the next curious human to dig. Tom knew it was only a matter of time before the static returned. Chapter 1. The Winding Road and the Whispers. They say that when you drive deep into the real backwoods, the kind of place where even Google Maps gives up, you're not just crossing a state line, you're crossing a timeline. My name is Thomas Kalin, and I, stupidly, was looking for a place called Oakhaven. The only reason I didn't turn my dirty rental sedan around and head back to civilization was the money. Cash. Piles of it, like it was self-printed. My job was to pick up the box, deliver it to someone, and disappear to the airport by morning. But Oakhaven, it wasn't a town. It was a failed legend. A tiny dot that should have been erased from the map back in 1980, buried deep within the Allegheny forests of Pennsylvania. Somewhere the fog was thicker than Grandma's gravy. I'd been driving for 17 hours. My headlights, two struggling yellow eyes in the dark, could barely pierce 3 feet ahead of me. And out there was just a wall of ancient pine and hemlock. The trees stood like giant skeletal sentinels. That's when I stopped, at this broken gravel intersection. I took a deep breath of the night air. Cold. Smelled like decaying pine needles, wet stone, and faintly blood. I shook my head. Just your imagination, Tom. I pulled out my LED flashlight, the only piece of modern tech still working out here, and shined its beam onto a rickety road sign. It was old wood, covered in lichen, and barely legible scratch marks. But the arrow pointed left, and in faded white paint, someone had written, Oakhaven, 3 miles. 3 miles. I could smell strong coffee and a filthy motel bed from that distance. I got back into the car. As I started to move forward, my flashlight, which I had set on the dashboard, flickered. I picked it up, thinking the battery was loose, and when I turned my body to set it back down, I saw them. In the rear window of the car, reflected in the solid blackness, were two little girls standing motionless at the edge of the woods. They were both wearing white dresses that looked threadbare, old-fashioned, maybe 1950 seconds era. Their hair was long, dark, obscuring part of their faces. They weren't moving. They were just staring. Not at me, but through me. Like I was the pane of glass they were looking past. My heart hammered against my ribs. Where were their parents? Why were they standing in the middle of the forest at 2 a.m? I hit the horn. They didn't react. Didn't flinch. Just silence. I felt my blood run cold. I didn't like this. This wasn't cheesy slasher horror. This was the weird, wrong kind of dread that creeps beneath your skin. I floored the gas. With a fast spin of tires on the gravel, I swerved left, leaving them behind in a cloud of dust. That's when I heard the sound on the radio. I hadn't turned the radio on. Even in New York, this radio only picked up hip-hop and economic news. Out here, it should have been pure static. But amidst the hiss and sputter of dead airwaves, there was a voice. A woman's voice. Quiet, like a whisper over your shoulder. They told me. They told me. I slammed the radio off button with my palm. It went silent. I started shaking. Not from fear, but from pure adrenaline. I was a courier, not a ghostbuster. I dealt with greedy people, not ghost children. I drove for less than half a mile when the woods opened up. The dirt road widened, and before me lay a shallow valley. A thick fog was rolling in, but through the mist, I saw it. Light, not the warm, inviting light of a town or a home. This was the wrong kind of light. There were 3 of them, distant, high up, floating over the valley, just above the treetops. Each was a different color, pale blue, neon green, and a sickly purple. The light wasn't shining. The light was pulsing, and beneath those lights in the valley was a house. A massive timber house, looking like an abandoned Victorian manor. Dark. Windows boarded up, roof sagging. Only one looked intact. A small window on the top floor. And from that window, there was another light, a stable yellow glow. I stopped the car. I pulled out the satellite phone I carried for emergencies, only working for GPS, not calls. I searched for Oak Haven. The blue dot on my screen blinked. Oak Haven. It pointed right there to that house in the valley. On the passenger seat, under the dim light of the dashboard, lay the leather duffel bag. Inside, the stack of Franklins I knew would change my life. I reached for the bag. Then, I saw the old piece of paper I'd pulled from the envelope hours ago. It was the note attached to my instructions, written in shaky, capitalized handwriting, "Do not follow the lights. The meeting is at the bridge. Do not look up." I crumpled the paper. The bridge? There was no bridge here, just the valley and that dark house. I looked up at the 3 bizarre colored lights pulsing in the sky, blue, green, purple. I should have turned around and left the bag on the seat, left the money. I should have lived. But I was a courier, and I never fail. I shifted the transmission into reverse, planning to search for this bridge. That's when my window was knocked. T-A-P, T-A-P, T-A-P on the driver's side window. Very close. I jumped back. My heart, which had just calmed, raced like a drum. I turned my head. Standing next to my car, in a small break in the trees, was a man. He was old. More than that, he was a fisher. He wore a greasy yellow slicker that was faded and a broken sou'wester hat. He was holding something in his outstretched hand. A lantern. The lantern wasn't lit. It was dark. But its beam, or lack thereof, seemed to block out the moonlight. I rolled my window down, just a quarter of the way. "Can I help you, old man?" I asked. My voice was hoarser than I expected. The old man didn't move. He let out a kind of snorting sound, like a cold old dog. "You're lost," he said. His voice was dry, like the rubbing of driftwood. "I'm looking for the Oak Haven Bridge," I replied. He pointed towards the valley to that dark house, to the 3 pulsing lights. "There is no Oak Haven Bridge," he said, his hollow eyes reflecting my dashboard light. "It fell years ago." "Then what is that?" I pointed to the lights in the sky. The old man didn't turn his head. He just looked at me. He tilted his head slightly. "People call 'em the will-o'-the-wisps," he whispered. "But it ain't a will, it's a call." He stepped closer, his eyes focused on the duffel bag on my passenger seat. "They told you, don't follow the lights," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. And you're asking me where the safe meeting place is? I couldn't answer. He knew. He knew my secret instructions. He raised the unlit lantern. You go down there to that house, you'll get your answer, but you'll pay a steep price. He paused, snorted again. But you don't have to go, you can. Follow me. He started to walk away, into the woods, slowly disappearing into the shadows. I'll take you to the place you're meant to be, he muttered, his voice almost lost to the rustle of the wind. I looked at the dead lantern he held. Then I looked back at the 3 blue, green, and purple lights over the valley, pulsing like a rotting heart. Beneath them, the dark house, and in the upstairs window, the stable yellow light. I didn't know who the old man was. Cop? Bandit? Something else? But I knew this. My job was down there, in that valley, in the place called Oakhaven. I ignored the cold voice inside me that screamed. I ignored the old man and his warning. I hit the gas. I was going where the money told me to go. I was going to follow the lights. Chapter 2. The House of Static. Fear is a funny thing. You think it paralyzes you, turns you into a statue, but the truth is, when enough adrenaline floods your system, fear becomes fuel. It becomes a reckless, stupid kind of bravery. I ignored the old man. I ignored the shivering girls and the whispering radio. I focused on the only thing I understood. The job. The money was waiting. And the lights, the blue, the green, the sickening purple, were guiding me to the drop point. The road deteriorated instantly. It wasn't a road anymore. It was a path choked with roots and slick mud. My rental car groaned in protest, but I pushed it. The drone of the lights vibrated not just in the air, but in the chassis of the car, and somehow, deep in my teeth, it felt like being trapped inside a giant, poorly tuned speaker. I rounded the final bend, and the house Oakhaven Manor loomed. It was a gothic nightmare stitched out of rotting timber and despair. 3 stories high, with a widow's walk that looked like a jagged crown. The porch was collapsed. The smell of mildew and wet rot was overwhelming. But 3 things stood out against the rot. 1, the 3 will-o'-the-wisp lights hovered directly above the house, casting rotating, sickly colors onto the facade. 2, the single yellow light shining steadily from that upstairs window, the only sign of life or power in this entire desolate valley. 3, the front door. It was slightly ajar, waiting. I grabbed the leather duffel bag. It felt heavy, heavy with money, heavy with consequence. I stepped out. The gravel beneath my feet was damp and cold. The air here wasn't just cold, it was dead. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. I looked up. The 3 lights seemed to be drawing the fog and the darkness into themselves. They weren't just atmospheric phenomena. They were machines. Or they were living things disguised as light. I walked toward the porch. I hesitated only a moment before pushing the door open. The inside of Oakhaven Manor was darker than the night outside, the kind of darkness that seems to have mass and volume. The air was thick with the dust of decades, the metallic scent of rust, and something else. Something sweet, like old, spilled wine. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom. The foyer was vast. A grand staircase with broken banisters swept up into the shadows. The floorboards were wide and dark, covered in generations of grime. Hello? My voice was swallowed immediately. It didn't even echo. The interior light, the stable yellow one, was upstairs. I needed to go up. As I moved across the foyer, I passed a grand framed portrait covered with a sheet. My curiosity, the same thing that drove me down this godforsaken road, made me stop. I pulled back the edge of the sheet. It was a family portrait. A man with a stern, severe face, a woman with thin, cold eyes, and 2 small children, 2 girls standing in front of them. They were wearing white dresses. My heart hammered again. The girls by the roadside. I dropped the sheet. I didn't stop to think about the logistics of time travel, or how a single family could possess the entire property in the middle of a federal forest. I just needed to deliver the package and leave. I started up the stairs. Halfway up, the stairs stopped creaking. The light from my flashlight, which had been steady, started to flutter. And the hum changed. It was no longer just a high-pitched drone. Now, it was layered with the sound of voices. I froze. I aimed the flashlight at the ceiling, but the light was failing. The code. The payment. Lost. They waited. Always watching. Don't follow. I slapped the flashlight. Nothing. Total darkness. Now, only the distant, constant yellow glow from the window above provided any guidance. I had to climb by touch. Finally, I reached the 2nd floor landing. The whispering static immediately receded, replaced by the crushing silence and the simple, oppressive hum. I stood on the landing, disoriented. Two halls stretched out, disappearing into the dark. And from the one on the left, I could clearly hear the sound of the yellow light. It wasn't a lamp. It was a television. I moved toward it, the duffel bag tucked under my arm. The hall was lined with doors, all closed. The last door at the end of the hall was where the light bled from beneath the crack. I stopped at the door. I raised my hand. Before I could knock, a woman's voice came from inside. Clear, measured. Come in, Mr. Kalin. It took you longer than expected. We were starting to think the old man got to you. I lowered my hand. She knew my name. She knew about the man in the slicker. The room was a jarring contradiction to the rest of the manor. It was small, dusty, but clearly occupied. There was a worn armchair, a portable oil heater, and a small wooden desk. And there was the television, an ancient tube set sitting on a crate. It wasn't playing a show, it was just displaying that hypnotic gray and white static. The yellow light was coming from the low-watt bulb screwed into a hanging cord above the desk. Sitting at the desk was the woman. She was young, mid-30s maybe, dressed simply in a dark sweater and jeans, beautiful in a sharp, fragile way. Her eyes were fixed on the screen, but I knew she was aware of every breath I took. She had a small black book open on the desk, and beside the book, a pistol. Not a decoration. Have a seat, Mr. Kalin, she said, without looking up. She pointed to the armchair. I didn't sit. I walked to the desk, dropped the duffel bag heavily onto the surface, and slid it toward her. The package is secure. The sum is exactly what was specified. My job is done. She glanced down at the bag, then back at the static-filled TV screen. Your job is never done, Thomas. Not out here. She slowly reached out, unzipped the bag, and peeked inside. The rustle of dollar bills. Excellent, she murmured. We keep our promises. She reached beneath the desk and pulled out a briefcase aluminum, scratched but locked. She slid it toward me. Your payment, half now, half upon delivery of the second package. I stared at the briefcase. Second package? The contract was for a single delivery. She finally looked at me. Her eyes were deep set and dark. The contract changes when you follow the lights, Thomas. They told you not to, yet here you are. That shows commitment. I followed the instructions for the drop point, I countered, keeping my voice even. I came to Oakhaven. No, you came to the call, she corrected, a thin smile playing on her lips. Oakhaven is the receiving station, the lights are the beacon, and the payment is the lure. She leaned forward, her voice dropping. The money you just delivered? It's for the power, the maintenance. It pays to keep the system running. What system? I demanded. She looked at the static on the screen, mesmerizing gray snow. The system that keeps the will-o'-the-wisps tethered to this location, she whispered. The system that keeps the rest of the world from noticing the hole in time we've dug here. I looked from her to the static to the yellow light. The old man's words echoed back. The bridge has been down for a long time. I need to know what I'm delivering next, I insisted, my hand instinctively reaching for the briefcase. You're delivering the fuel, she said. The second package is a person, specifically the man who hired you, your client. My blood ran cold. You want me to kidnap my own client? He's not a client. He's a reluctant component, she explained, picking up the small black book on her desk. She flipped it open. The pages were covered in dense, handwritten formulas and diagrams. We were never supposed to pay him. We were only supposed to use him to find someone else, someone who came through the anomaly years ago, someone he was trying to track down. She pointed to a symbol in the book, a circle bisected by a jagged line. This is the luminous anchor, the lights outside. They need to feed. They feed on energy, on static, on displaced souls. She looked straight into my eyes, and her composure finally broke, replaced by a flicker of madness. The girls you saw, Thomas? The ones in the white dresses? They were my sisters. They followed the lights 40 years ago. They are now the conductors, trapped in the static, powering the anomaly. She slammed the book shut. Your client has the genetic signature we need to stabilize the anchor. You bring him back here to this room, and he will be the final ingredient. His energy will free my sisters and allow the anchor to seal this place forever. I backed away, hands up. I'm out. I take my money, and I leave. The deal is void. No, Thomas, she said, her voice now sharp as broken glass. She picked up the pistol and aimed it squarely at my chest. The deal is sealed. You followed the lights? The anchor recognized you. That's why your flashlight failed. That's why the radio spoke. She stood up, tall, menacing. You have been chosen as the next courier.